Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is, I think it's Tuesday. No, it's Wednesday, January 28th, 2026. And I'm going to be doing another session on my Serpent by the Way series just because the reason I haven't done a video on this in a while is because I've been just going back over the old writing and refining the writing and shaking out some of the ideas that I've since moved on from. If you guys have followed this from the beginning, obviously there's a lot of ideas that I had in the beginning that were pretty wonky. They're not that strange though, because it's like I'm actually finding similar ideas in the early church, in the ancient Greeks, and what it really is it's a human being looking at the data and then kind of conjecturing or speculating on how this stuff fits together in terms of these gods and their human ancestors and stuff like this. And it's clear that, obviously I'm not the first one to do this, right? Like, you have the Jews from the Second Temple period doing it. You have a lot of the philosophers and Greek historians and writers. Like, pretty much as soon as we have historical writing going on, we have people trying to make sense of the various gods and myths and legends and histories of the various people and how they intersect and how they connect together. So you guys have probably heard me at the beginning of this be really critical of Alexander Hislop's idea of Ninus and Semiramis, or Nimrod and Semiramis as a couple. Well, that idea actually goes all the way back to this guy named, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but it's like Cestius of Canaanite, which is basically a historian who is he's kind of like a military leader of a troop of mercenaries who is also a physician. And so when these troops basically get beaten by the Persians, he becomes part of the Persian court. And the Greeks have a really bad understanding of Assyrian history. This guy claims to write the history of Assyria, but it's really awful. By the time the Greeks come into contact with the Persians in terms of militarily, the world of the Middle East, which is basically, that's going to include Israel, Babylon, all of it, to them that is just Assyria. That's just one big chunk of land, and they basically don't consider any, remember, the Persians are ruling over everything, so they consider two types of people. There's basically the civilized people they're going to call Assyrians, and then the Bedouin people, the more nomadic herds people and stuff like that, they're going to call the Arabians. So that's all they think there are. They think there's Assyrians and Arabians, and there's just a bunch of cities or city-states that are underneath this dominion, as if there's basically been an unbroken history of succession going all the way back to Nimrod or Sargon, which is interesting how they call the founder of Nineveh Ninus, and they give no reference to Sargon, even though Sargon's very clearly in Assyrian history because one of their later kings is called Sargon II, named after Sargon I. So the Greeks don't know this though, because it's the Assyrians have been utterly destroyed by the Medes and Babylonians. I mean, their cities have been laid waste, their temples have been destroyed. Nobody knows they've got these buried cache of cuneiform writing, and nobody's using cuneiform anymore. They're using Aramaic, and they've been using Aramaic since the Assyrian Empire. They're the ones who standardized it, and then the Babylonians are going to keep using the Aramaic script, and after them the Persians are going to use a version of the Aramaic script. So by the time you get to the Greeks, nobody's studying cuneiform. If they have anything, it's coming through secondhand history from maybe the Babylonians, who are still have a pretty substantial city, and it's one of, I think, 4 capitals in the Persian Empire. But you're not getting anything from Assyria itself. So they know of Assyria. They know the land, having names like Syria and Assyria is based on the Assyrian Empire. But they don't really know anything about the history of the Middle East like we know today in terms of archaeology. And so they're going to make it sound like there's, this Ninus and Semiramis. And Semiramis, her name is Shamaramat, is actually a she is a queen of Assyria that for a time seemed to have held power when her husband died, but this would have been in the period of the Assyrian Empire. I think it's just prior to like Sennacherib and those people in Judah, and this would have been around the time that they're warring with Babylon and sacking Babylon. And I think she is responsible for building the walls of Babylon, or rebuilding the walls of Babylon, at least legendarily, after it's destroyed by the Assyrians. Which is why people look at her, oh, she's this wall builder, and they start, the Christians start conjecturing that if she's the wall builder of Babylon, she must have built the Tower of Babel, she must be involved with that, that must be, and of course, the Assyrians are calling Ninus and Shumarama, or Semiramis, husband and wife. Well, they don't seem to be. There may be another guy named Ninus who might be a consort of hers, but the other thing is, the reason the Greeks are calling the founder of Nineveh Ninus is this is just what the Greeks do. The Greeks will literally have multiple stories of, oh, that city's called Athens. Well, that's because there was a guy named Attica, King Attica. And then another person will be like, no, there's a god named Athena. And they're both, descriptives of where Athens gets its name, basically. And the Greeks just make stuff up. They're either getting it from hearsay, from merchants, from far away, or they're making it up themselves. And the Greeks seem to be very liberal with making up ancient patriarchs and stuff like that cities are named after, and then tying them together in genealogies that don't make a whole lot of sense, and they don't really line up with much of anything else. And the reason is because the Greeks are actually some of the last people to get a writing system. They're not going to get a writing system till like 800 BC, whereas the Egyptians and Sumerians and Akkadians and Hebrews and Phoenicians and all these other people, they've been using a writing system for about 600 years longer, whereas the Greeks, back after, I believe it was the Egyptians and the Danites that gave them Linear A and Linear B, it seemed to have been mostly used among an elite class, that when that elite class dissolved, which I believe to be the Danites, they stopped using that script. So from around 1400 BC to 800 BC, so a space of 600 years, they're illiterate. They're basically, they have cities and stuff, and they have kings, and they have wars and stuff like that, but their culture is essentially, farming and goat herding and stuff like that. They're not really that advanced. And then they're going to get writing in the 8th century BC, and they're just going to go to town with writing. I mean, they write more than anybody once they get a script. And what you have is a lot of people establishing themselves for the first time as experts, but they're so far removed from the data and the history that their histories tend to be pretty bad. And then these people are going. There's also this huge market for buying books and histories and stuff like this. And this is why you have all these people establishing themselves as philosophers with schools, because they'll go travel to like Phoenicia in the Near East, and they're going to get all this information from the foreigners and write it down for the first time. Well, the information is often really bad, because in a lot of cases, they're probably buying the information from merchants and stuff. Like, hey, tell us where the Arabians came from. Tell us where the Persians came from. Tell us about their history. And if they're paying for this information that they can write down and then, peddle as fact, well, then the people are going to make stuff up. So they can, and they're going to make up these deep, elaborate histories that don't make sense. And you're going to have a lot of weird myths and legends. Oh, that's the phoenix. Phoenicia is named after the phoenix, and the phoenix is this bird that rises from the ashes that's in Arabia. Well, no, Phoenicia is actually named after the purple dye. It's puny or something like that. It has to do with the purple dye that the Phoenicians make from this shell, from this mollusk, and use it to dye clothes, and they're the first people to come up with a purple dyed cloth. And the Aryans tend to name people after what they do for a living. So They're going to name these people Phoenicians because those are the guys who make the purple dye. This is just an Aryan trait that you're going to find everywhere, from India to Germany to England, everywhere. This is why we have people named Smith and Baker and Carpenter and stuff like that. This is just what the Aryans do. And the Greeks are heavily influenced by the Aryans because they're related to them, but they're also mixing with them and getting a lot of their lore from them, especially before they get writing. So you have all these people that are basically selling the Greeks these stories and legends, and then you probably have the Danites among them too, where they're putting together their religion. It's very clear that somebody who has looked at the evolution of religion in the Middle East has cobbled together the Greek pantheons and gods and their legends and stuff like that. And we have quite a bit of evidence that, this stuff is not historically valid. I mean, we have a record from Phoenicia that says, for instance, King Menelaus, which is basically the guy who loses Helen in the story of the Trojans and Helen of Troy and all this, okay? This is the guy whose wife gets taken. And the Phoenicians have on record that this guy sailed to Tyre, and he met King Hiram of Tyre, the same King Hiram of Tyre who helped Solomon build his temple. Well, that's a problem because the destruction of Troy, we now know archaeologically, was like 200 years before that, so there's no way this guy could have visited that guy. But what nobody considers is that Homer is just pulling names from records and stuff he knows because he's a Greek, and he's writing this stuff down as if it's a history, and he's adding God and myth and legend and stuff. And so he's taking known names, but this is not chronological. This is why you have Hercules and the Heraclidae, the descendants of Hercules and stuff like this. These guys are emerging in his story, which is written in the 8th century, about events that take place in the beginning of the 12th century, so 400 years earlier. And you probably have stuff, maybe there was a guy named Hercules, and he could have been like a king or a warlord or whatever in Greece, but they're clearly ripping off stuff that has to do with Samson for Hercules legends. And so you might have had this guy who was named Hercules, but the name, we've talked about this in other videos, it means Hera's glory, and it doesn't make sense with the Hercules myth, because according to the Hercules myth, Zeus cheated on Hera with, I forget what her name is, but he cheats on her with this woman, and that's how Hercules is born. So why is he called Hera's glory? That's normally what you would call somebody's son. Well, Hera in Hebrew means the one who became pregnant. Remember, the Greeks are known for calling people by their titles, and we just don't happen to have in the book of Judges a name for Samson's mom. And so we have these various gods that are Perseus, which means from Zeus, and this woman named Danae, which is basically a feminine Danite, okay? Which that Samson's mom is a Danite. And then we have Hera, which is she who became pregnant, and Samson's mom is famous for becoming pregnant, even though she was barren. And we have the same name. We know what this means because we know that one of the names for Ashtoreth, who becomes pregnant with the Nephilim, is Ishara, which literally means, in Semitic, it means the woman who became pregnant. So shock, Samson's looked at as this demigod, and his mom has got this shortened form of Ishara or Asherah, which is Hera, which is she became pregnant. Okay, so we look at all these things, but by the time you get to Homer and Hesiod, they get codified. It's kind of, this becomes their canon, because both of these books are going to emerge probably within a generation of each other, and they're going to disagree on some things, but it's very clear by this time there is an organized priesthood, or at least a cult of wise men that are putting together an organized Greek history and an organized Greek pantheon, something like the Bible, and something like, these pantheons of the Middle Eastern gods. And so there's going to be legends and myths all in this thing that are clearly borrowed from versions of Near Eastern myths, like the Kumarbi myth, which is this myth about how, like, this god bites off this higher god's genitals. And you can find this myth that involves like younger gods overthrowing older gods, and this idea of castrating or something like that the older gods, that is really about people overthrowing governments, and that then gets deified as something that happens among the gods, because they're writing gods according to what their lusts want to do. If the gods are doing that, then it's just for us to do it because we're a reflection of them, and this is all based on fate, and so we can do this. And so you have this idea of this starts all the way back probably somewhere around 2000 BC, or around the time after Sargon overthrows his empire. So I think that's actually like 19th century. And you have somebody write something like this about the gods being overthrown, and I think it involves a castration. And then you go up into, I believe it was in the Kumarbi myth, I believe was Hittite, or from Mari, which would have been Amorite. And it talks about this god biting off the genitals of this god, and then it creates a god or something like that. And then you get to the Greek version of it, and it's Zeus castrating Kronos, and out of the foam of his castrated genitalia is born Aphrodite, which means the foam, and that's their love goddess. Okay, so it's very clear that the people in Greece, by the time you get to 8th century, I mean, this is really late when you consider paganism in terms of like these big, robust hierarchies of gods that basically, again, start out as a combination of ideas and ancestors, and then also probably versions of the Father, Spirit, and Son, and the serpent. And then they keep morphing with stories of these kings over centuries and centuries until they become legends. Obviously, the Tower of Babel makes room for a lot of that because that common history is lost. The common names are lost, and what you have is legends that are remembered. And then you have bits and pieces of history within the context of the legend that you can kind of extrapolate out if you have a standard of history that you can hold that up next to and say, oh, this makes sense then. Okay, well, that standard of history for me is the Bible, and so I can look at these different myths and legends and be like, this probably came from that, and this probably came from that. And, for instance, we know that by the 8th century, when Hesiod and Homer are writing, there's no way they have kept an oral history of who all these different kings and fathers and sons and legends are. They're making this stuff up. They're writing an epic, and they probably are involved in some kind of cult that is trying to come up with a Greek nationalism, because you have the Olympic Games starting around the same time. This is all within about 50 to 75 years of each other. You have the Olympic Games starting, and this idea of bringing the torch to these different places from Olympus, and it's the idea of the divine fire going from city to colonies and unifying the Greek world to say, hey, we were all founded by the Greeks, we're all one Greek culture. But in reality, their gods are a combination of stuff that comes from the Hittites, the Thracians, the Greeks, the Danites, the Phoenicians, and the Egyptians. And they're bringing together all their versions of these gods and coming up with their own story on where it came from. And it is probably the worst in terms of historical validity. But it goes down in our history as being the best because we know the Greeks as the founders of logic and philosophy and history and science and all this writing and rhetoric and all this advanced education and stuff like that. We know of the Greeks in that way. And because of that, we look back at them as like these ancient people who kept these great records. And reality is they were just latecomers to the game who had really bad records but wrote a ton. And then they meditated on that stuff to come up with the philosophies, okay? But like Tatian the Assyrian is going to write this treatise against the Greeks in the 2nd century AD, and he is just going to shred them and talk about how everything they have is ripped off from the Egyptians, the Persians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. And he's an Assyrian, so he just hates the Greeks. He sees them as just like these crap scholars and these people who just, pontificate on a lot of stuff and write a lot of stuff, but they don't have good information on almost anything. So, how does that lead us into India and the Hindus? Well, we're going to have similar things with the Indians and the Hindus, because remember, we don't have a record of the Hindus having a script of their own at all. I mean, we know there was an ancient, probably antediluvian Harappan script that it doesn't seem like anybody has ever been able to decipher. And the reason would be because that colony, let's see if we can pull up an image here. That colony, if you look at, we go back to the pre-flood world, you would have had the Canaanites east of Eden over here, which would have been basically eastern Iraq and southeastern Iran, and that's their base. That's where they're spreading from. And then you have the Sethites that are along the Euphrates, and that's where they're spreading from. And so their first wars are going to be between the Tigris and Euphrates, but use some common sense. Where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go up the Euphrates, and then they're going to go down the coast of the Mediterranean. They're going to colonize Egypt from the north. The Canaanites are going to go down the Persian Gulf, and they're going to colonize India and go over here and colonize Kush and North Africa. They're just following the coast of this is how people are going to colonize. The easiest way to get around and explore is get yourself a boat and just go around the coast or up the rivers. And the easiest way to build a colony, obviously you need to be near fresh waters, to go upriver and downriver. And then you follow the coast to the next point where the river comes out, and then you find another place you can colonize. Okay, and so this is how they're colonizing. And so, surprise, surprise, they're going to go around here, and there's probably other little settlements and stuff that they had, but the main places they're going to go to is the big rivers. So the Canaanites are going to go around here, and they're going to find the Nile. They're going to go around here, and they're going to find the Indus. And the Sethites are going to do the same thing. They're going to go down here and find the Nile, and that's why you have the myth of Horus and Seth, because you have an Egyptian king called Horus the warrior, and then Seth is Seth, who basically seems to be against his descendants who try to take over Egypt and overthrow it around the time of the death of Adam and Cain. I believe Cain is buried here in Egypt. I believe that's where he finally ends up, but he's probably, remember, he's going to live to be at least 800 years old, I would assume. And then he's probably involved with the colonization here. I mean, 800 years is a very long time, right? And you're going to have this Nakada, and they date this to 2600 BC, pre-flood. I'm just going to take that as, if it is, that's so old compared to the Bible, this likely can only be Cain's tomb. Because unless you have other people dying of murder, I mean, you're talking about, I take that back. This would not be Cain's tomb, because Cain would have died between 4000 and 3000 BC, so towards the end of 3000 BC. So this is 500 years later, okay? This is the Nakada period, and this is how old they suspect this thing to be. And we can see this thing. This is on the map of the wall, and there's, some people disagreeing. Again, this is Reddit conversations and stuff like this. What is this? But multiple people are saying it's a map of the world. This is what this is. And this is the Canaanite settlement where basically your death cult happens, and that little portal there is like something like the gate to the underworld. That's what they believe. And then what are these other ones? Well, this is what I think they are. And it's not the most obvious thing, but they have two altars on them. You see, it looks like there's flames coming off this altar, but none on the other one. You see, it looks like there's flames coming off of this altar, but none on the other one, okay? What is that representing? And I believe it represents God choosing Abel over Cain. And the Sethites are going to inherit the priesthood that would have come from Abel, but Abel was murdered by Cain. And I believe their symbol for their colonies, again, these boats represent their colonies, because where are they going? Up and down rivers, up and down sea coasts to colonize. And I believe these represent the dominions of their colonies in various places in the world. And then you could argue that this could be just Asia and this is Africa, or this could be the Americas, and this is Australia's one big landmass. Because remember, before the flood, you had a nice bubble over the earth, which means the sea levels were lower. We're also going to have this for a while after the flood, because the Lord makes a great wind to pass over the earth, and so we're going to have an ice age. This great wind is going to pass over the earth in the center, and it's going to be pushing all these basically waters northward, just like you have in the Exodus. And they're going to form big glacial ices up here, okay? And so based on what we can see from, for instance, the Oxus Valley civilization, which seems to be the most developed northern civilization, and it's going to be, you see, here's Iran, the Iranian Plateau, here's India, here's the Himalayas. The Oxus is right up here, and it's basically based on rivers that flow from the Himalayas northward towards the Caspian Sea, and I think some of it even flow as far towards the North Sea, the Arctic Ocean. But they start out in the Himalayas because that's the high point, right? And so the Amu Darya or Oxus River is going to form this civilization. What are the Japhethites doing over there? Well, it's within 50 years of the flood that they seem to form this civilization, and it's to get tin. They're forming this culture to this colony to get tin from Afghanistan, because as their families are growing, they're going to need that to make more bronze tools. Well, Noah would have known this was here because he would have needed bronze and iron and stuff like that before the flood. Iron is metal that is stronger and more readily available, but it takes a lot more work, which means he probably was using a lot of bronze, and he was getting that from here probably before the flood to build the ark. Japheth was 100 years old, roughly, by the time they get in the flood, so he knew where this was coming from, and Noah probably just sent him and said, go start a colony over there to get us the tin so we can make more bronze as our families are growing. Now, they're able to dig up some stuff from these different sites and stuff that have been flooded over, that they can probably find some tools and stuff like this, and probably find bronze implements and stuff like this. But he's sending them over here to get fresh stuff. Remember, bronze and these metals and stuff, they rust and corrode and break down, and the whole world's been covered by pretty much an ocean. So probably a lot of these things, they're not expecting a lot of this stuff to last forever. So they're sending them to get fresh tin, to get bronze. And then these trade routes are going to basically be along, let's see if I can expand this here, from the Amu Darya region over here, and this is why you have, it's called the Bactria Margiana complex, or the Oxus culture, over here, and it's just going to go overland, probably come down here across the Caspian Sea, and then you're into the region of Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia right here. Well, surprise, surprise, traditionally it's held that Japheth is buried in Azerbaijan and Noah is buried in Armenia. And it makes sense because the connection between their colony over here and this over here, these are going to be their main two civilizations here. And so what you have here is the Oxus civilization at the Tower of Babel falls apart. It just splits up. And these people are going to, by this time, have created horse carts or ox-drawn carts and horse-drawn carts and chariots and stuff like that. And so they're able to expand a lot more broadly over land than these guys are, who are mostly expanding up rivers and down seas. Because again, without the horses and the chariots and stuff like that, which aren't going to come into play until really the time where the Jews are in Egypt, so after the Tower of Babel, these guys have camels, and then they have mules for transport, right? So you go a lot more slowly. Camels and mules aren't really known for pulling wheeled things, whereas you can get a horse or an ox to do that, right? So these guys they also need bronze for the implements to do all this, and these guys are pulling a lot of bronze here. The Egyptians are eventually going to catch up, but they start out buying their stuff from these Mitanni. And these Mitanni are essentially the Japhethites who are still connected to these routes over here. And then they're mixing with the Semites of Haran. So the Aram Naharim are a mixture of Aramaeans and Nahorites. This is going to come to mean to these guys, Naram Naharim means Aram between the rivers, which is really just a way of saying, that's, the Greeks say Mesopotamia means between the rivers, and Naharim also means rivers. It's a plural, but it's also the name for Nahor, Abraham's brother, who just happens to live up here in the Haran region, okay? So the Jews are getting their wives from there, and that's how the chariots and the sickle sword, these other bronze things, are going to spread to Egypt, and Egypt is going to become a powerful empire. They're going to have cities up here. Byblos is going to be one. Carchemish is going to be one. And those are their main trade links that link them with the Mitanni, but these are really just the relatives of the Israelites who are living with them. Meanwhile, over here you have the Hittites, and the Hittites are going to be becoming a powerful empire, and it seems to be the growth of that empire spurns the tin trade that is going to come from over here in Tartessos all the way up to England. Remember, these, if you see these high sea levels the way they are, they would have shrunk by probably like within 100 years of the Tower of Babel. And we're going to find these in myths and legends. We're going to find this other flood where it says the islands, what used to be the mountains became the islands and stuff like this. But back when these guys started here to colonize this stuff, they would have probably had overland routes that let you get over, north and south of Africa. You see this connection here between Italy and Greek, and how it's almost connected to Africa in multiple points. And if you compare that to this Nakata map, it's very similar looking. See how you see this is probably where Italy and Greece are, and you see how the Mediterranean seems to be connected and spotty in multiple places like that. Well, that's because there's lower sea levels, okay? And so they're able to follow the veins of tin, and again, miners know how to do this stuff. I'm not a miner, but like they know how to find veins of minerals and then follow them to where they're likely going because of a volcanic or an earthquake or something like that has exposed that metal from beneath the earth. And so they follow it there. And by the time you get there, they're digging down in these mines and they're following the vein of the mineral down, 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 just like guys will do with oil. Oil started out on the surface, and then they kept digging and digging and digging and getting to the deeper oil wells underneath the earth. It's the same thing with the minerals, okay? And we have this. We know they talk about this in Job, which is before the Tower of Babel, how men will dig deep into the earth to find all these minerals and jewels and stuff like that. Okay, so before the dwarves, there were just men who just mined for stuff, and so Tarshish seems to be the first people here, which is why the Tartessos is going to be the civilization in the south of Spain that seems to be the ones who are mining England, and then they were shipping it through. This is Sicily and Sardis, which are going to be called, the Sardinians and the Sicilians are going to be called Shekelesh and I forget what it is, Sardani or something like that by the Egyptian sea peoples, because eventually the sea levels are going to low and they become seafaring peoples, and the main hubs that they're going to be shipping this stuff is going to be to Crete, where it gets sold to the Egyptians, and to Troy, where it gets sold to the Hittites. Okay, and we've talked about this in my Danite stuff. This will all be in my book. Is how the Danites seem to have basically stolen these trade routes from them. And that's how they caused the Bronze Age collapse, actually. And so, if you look at old maps or these are basically archaeological maps and stuff like this, of where your historians and archaeologists suspect the how the Indo-Aryan culture spread, or they call it the Indo-Aryan migration. Indo-Aryan just basically means Caucasians, Japhethites. Okay, well, they don't believe in a flood. They don't believe in Noah's flood. They're not going to admit that into evidence. They don't believe that these people were following known routes towards known mineral deposits and then digging up the cultures, because why wouldn't you? Think about this. You're moving across land on routes towards places that you knew once existed, because Shem, Ham, and Japheth lived for a century before the flood, and Noah lived for 600 years before the flood. So they know where these settlements and civilizations are. Now, when you get there, there's a whole bunch of stuff that was buried in the flood. Probably a lot of it lightly buried. I mean, if you're downhill from a mountain, yeah, that's going to be covered over by a lot of mud. But most of these things are going to be on riverbeds and stuff like that in pretty prime locations. And then you're building on the foundations of their old buildings and stuff, because a lot of these buildings were made of clay and clay mixed with straw and stuff like that. So but their foundation is rock. So you're rebuilding on their foundations, and you're digging up their front yard and their backyard and their basement as you're farming and stuff like that. And what are you finding? Oh, you're finding cups, you're finding bowls, you're finding swords, you're finding knives, hatchets, all this stuff that they used to have. And that's just a quick and easy way to get free stuff rather than forging a new thing for metal, right? And so you have these cultures of people that seem to have pre-existed the flood that were buried, and they tended to bury people with certain their tools and stuff like that. Well, that might have, or it might be these Japhethites who are coming afterward and saying, hey, what do we do with the bodies? Because think about this. They're not just digging up tools. They're digging up bodies where they're settling. Because these are people who suddenly died in the flood and they were buried over. Okay, well, surprise, surprise, you have these mound building cultures. You also have people finding mass graves. Okay, now these mass graves could have been from warfare before the flood, or they could have been the Japhethites just showing up and redigging up their old civilization and going, well, what do we do with the 500 bodies that are here? Dig a mass grave for them all. And then what are we doing to distinguish them? Well, we're going to bury them with some of their, tools and stuff like that to recognize who they are. Remember, these people all started out believing these people are going to be resurrected one day. Okay? And so you find these civilizations that are like, this is the bell beaker and the cordware. These are types of, and the cordware would be like pots with like a rope wrapped around them for like a handle or something like that. Bell beaker is the shape of a cup that they would have, and they would find these commonly buried with these people. And so they would name these cultures after this, and out of this, these guys are going to kind of speculate about how these cultures are connected and where they migrated. Well, how come everywhere they have these people migrating is, you've got them starting out, this is what they believe. Notice 4000 BC in Anatolia. Why are they only north of Anatolia? This is silly. Why do you think these people were here in 4000 BC, and despite being here in Anatolia in 4000 BC, we find none of them downriver from where they came from, which would be the most obvious place you would go. They're all to the north. It doesn't make any sense unless you understand, well, there was a flood, and there's Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah basically said, Japhethites, you're going to get the north, which he says they're going to have dominion, right? And then the Semites are going to get the middle, and the Hamites are going to get the south. That makes perfect sense. And so what do you find? You find the Hamites mostly spreading down here in the south. They're going to go across Africa, Southeast Asia, and into Mesoamerica, mostly by southern routes. You're going to find the Japhethites getting the horses. Gomer, the son of Japheth, the firstborn of Japheth, seems to be the main horse breeder, and his people are going to become the first ever cavalry-based military, as opposed to chariot-based military. But even the chariot-based military, chariots weren't their main thing. It was mostly foot soldiers, and the chariots were like tanks, where you could drive around and harass people and stab them with your spears and run them over with your spokes with blades coming out of them, weird stuff like that. While most people were, swords and shields and bows and stuff like that. So the reason why, notice they have 5th and 4th millennium BC, and then they have the Anatolian 4000 BC, okay? Well, in Anatolia, again, these guys who are coming up from Eden, they're going to go upriver. And so in Anatolia, this is going to be some of the earliest settlements for the people probably who are trying to escape the wars that are coming. The 4000 BC, I wouldn't trust that dating, because 4000 BCE is basically the beginning of creation. But the reason they're doing that is because they know Göbekli Tepe's there, and that's like 6000 BC, and it seems like they're trying to cultivate grains and stuff like that, okay? Well, here's the thing. You ain't going to try to cultivate grains on top of a mountain, which is where Göbekli Tepe is. You're going to do it on the river systems where you can irrigate and stuff like that. So why is this up here? And the answer is these are people trying to escape from the warfare going on down here and probably start back over. That's probably what they are. You see this Yamana culture. This is 3000 BC. That's around the time of the death of Adam. And so you would have had this main culture up here, which would be similar to after the flood. You probably have a lot of roads that are going straight across these rivers, because they're not going up and down the rivers. They're using horse carts and chariots and stuff like that to get across. And that becomes like the main center of this culture. And then it's going to spread over here and over here. And these cultures here are going to be mostly based on, remember, it would have been much warmer at this time, but these are probably cultures of people trying to get away from the non-stop warfare that's going on here. Okay? And then they're eventually going to get, their own wars and stuff like that afterwards. And then you see all the stuff here that you notice 800 AD or 800 BC. This is silly. 800 BC is around the time of the Syrians. They're going to act like these guys just got into Iran around 800 BC. This is silly. That would be around the time that these people are all uniting and expanding against the Assyrians. Because Urartu, which was their main civilization after the Aksu River civilization collapses because of the Tower of Babel, the next one is going to be this Mitanni, which is going to be an alliance of Shemites and Japhethites against these Hittites who are trying to dominate right here, and these Amorites who are trying to dominate right here. So remember, both Shem and Japheth are given a commission by Noah to subdue the Canaanites, because the Canaanites are the ones spreading around the false religion. So you've got Hittites up here who are Canaanites, you've got Amorites down here who are Canaanites, and those are the two most dominant civilizations next to Egypt. And so the Egyptians aren't the ones that Noah points to and says they're the problem, it's the Canaanites. And so the Israelites are friends with the Egyptians, and so these guys are willing to train with the Egyptians and empower them, being Shemites and Hamites, but the Canaanites are the problem. And the Canaanites have these powerful civilizations, and they're probably super militant because they know they're supposed to be subdued. Okay? And so their main alliance and kingdom, where they're pouring in the chariots and the weapons and stuff like this, is here in the Mitanni. And that kingdom is going to eventually get absorbed by the Assyrians. And what's going to end up happening is a new kingdom is going to emerge up here around the region of the Ark called Urartu. Okay? And Urartu is going to continue from about 900 BC to around 600 BC, 500 BC. Okay? And then the Assyrians are going to basically subdue and weaken that kingdom. Okay? And it's when they subdue and weaken that kingdom that the Medes and the Iranians, remember they're all related. So Gomer would have been the forefather of them, and the dynasty that seems to be in Armenia. 5 of their kings have the name Rusha. Okay, Rusha is their king's name, and I suspect that kingdom becomes the Kiev and Rus, because what you're going to have here is Gomer's going to have 3 sons, Ashkenaz, which is where the Ashkenazis are the Aryans, okay? I don't think that's a coincidence that Nazi is the Ashkenazis, okay? They also have a swastika as their symbol, okay? These are the Aryans, okay? And then they're one of 3 brothers who are sons of Gomer. I think Ashkenaz is the youngest. I could be wrong. Ashkenaz might be the oldest. So you have Gomer, which is right here, and they become the Sumerian horse lords that are right here. You have Togarma, which becomes the Turkish people, and the Aryans are going to call them Turan. And then you're going to have the Ripheans, and the Riphath is going to be the 3rd son. So there's Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarma are going to be the 3 sons of Gomer. And they seem to become the Finno-Uralic people, because the Ural Mountains used to be called the Riphean Mountains, and those essentially are the people who, I believe, become the Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, and Finns, who are all going to get dominated by Meshech, the Muscovites, and I believe the Slavic languages come from Meshech, okay? And Meshech is going to be Gomer's younger brother, okay? Magog and Meshech are going to be Gomer's younger brothers, okay? So those cultures is where you get the main 3 languages groups: the Finno-Uralic language group, the Slavic language group, and the Ashkenaz is going to be your Germanic and your Persian language groups. And then the Gomerites are going to be right here, so they're going to be South Russian, and eventually their language is just going to be the merger of all these peoples together. But the Gomerites are right here where you see the 5th and 4th millennium BC steppe cultures here, okay? Remember, there's civilizations that these people are probably digging up right away, and the main guys who have the horses are right here. So that's the center. It makes sense that the guys are doing the majority of the horse breeding are the center of this new evolving culture. And then you see Andronovo right here. It says to 1700 BC. The reason this is here is this is the expansion of the people north from Oxus after it falls at the Tower of Babel. And out of that, you're going to have a culture that's going to grow here called the Vedic culture, which is basically the Aryans these guys would have been trading with the Hamites for a long time, because the Hamites can get jade from over here. They can get all these spices from over here. They've got the river system here, which they're probably farming and producing a lot more farm goods than, remember, these are going to be the Canaanites, and Ham is going to spread from here to here, up these river systems. And so they're trading with them for their farm goods, their spices, maybe jade, and while these guys are trading up here for tin and bronze and stuff like that, because this culture is very metallurgical here. And when it falls apart, these people are going to split and go towards the north to become the Andronovo culture, towards the south to become the Vedic culture, and then the Aryans among them are also going to spread into Iran, and Iran is based on the name Aryan. Aryan just means noble, okay? So think about this. If Gomer has, I want to make sure that Ashkenaz is going to be his oldest son. So we've got Ham, we got Japheth, we got Gomer. Okay, so Gomer's firstborn is Ashkenaz. If this is common sense, your firstborn son is going to be where your ruling nobility comes from, okay? So the ruling nobility of the Gomerites, remember the Gomerites you're going to find a capital of the Sumerians, and it's called Gomera, okay? It's named after Gomer, okay? Also, probably the Indo-Iranian first man, Geomart, is probably based on Gomer. It's probably an expansion of his name based on words that essentially mean the mortal man or the mortal one. And they count their forefather as the author of all humanity instead of just them. And then they're going to talk about him dividing the land between his three sons, which they call Sarm, Turan, and Iraj. And they're going to say that's where the Iranians, the Turanians, which are the Tagarma, and Sarm is the name for the Sarmatians, which seem to be based in Rifath. They're also these people who are known for using this battle cry where they cry out the name Rosh, and that they were like horse lords. They were the best horse lords. When the Romans found them, these guys could ride horses like nobody else. And so it's possible that line of King Rosha became the Sarmatians and then eventually became the Kievan Rus. It's very possible. But they're going to hold to him dividing the land between his three sons, because they're mixing this up with, remember, these guys are illiterate for many, many centuries as well. They're going to be mixing up the story of probably Noah dividing the earth to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, with Gomer dividing the world to these three. And they're going to say the center of the world is Iran. The two Iranians are the guys who are in the north, and the Sarm are the guys who are in the west. Well, the Sarmatians would actually go into Anatolia and stuff like that too. So this Ashkenaz is going to be the main people we're following. Those are the ones who are called Aryans because they're the nobles. They're the firstborn of the sons of Gomer. So this would be the oldest the oldest grandson of Japheth, because it's the oldest son of his oldest son. So it shouldn't be shocking that when the Japhethites were a unified culture before the Tower of Babel, which one of them are counted as the nobility, and that's Ashkenaz. And it is out of this idea that both the Persians and the Germans see themselves as the highest caste of people, okay? Because it's out of an original idea that has to do with heritage. It's not based on racism, okay? But it just so happens that these people are going to be the whitest people in India and also the whitest people in Europe, because that's where they're going to spread to. The other white people are going to essentially be in these cultures over here, which are going to mostly come under Russia's dominion. And since Russia is based on their younger brother, that's going to be their main competitor for dominion. Rifath would be basically where the Russian peoples come from. And Meshech is actually a younger brother. You see Tiras right here is where the Thracians come from. Meshech is where the Mushki, the Moshkoi, and Moskva, that's the name for Moscow. Moshki or Mishki just means the people of Meshech. Moscow just means the city of Meshech. Moskva is what they call it, okay? Tubal is going to be, there's going to be a city in Anatolia called Table. There's going to be Tbilisi in Georgia, which is probably, my guess would be Tubal's city is what Tbilisi means. And then Tobolsk means isk or ish at the end of the word, just means the city. It just means the place of the Tubalish people, Tobolsk. Okay. Javan is going to become Ionia. They're going to call it Yawin. So the Hittites are going to take over these people called the Lydians. You're going to see that spelled as Lydians, but actually the Greeks would use the Y would be a U sound. So they're the Lydians, which are the it's not this Ludim. Those aren't Egyptian Ludim. It's actually the this Lud. So you see Aram, Lud. They're going to be next to each other in Syria and Anatolia. Arphaxad is going to have his people in basically Babylon. Asher's going to be to the north of Babylon and the Tigris. Elam is going to be in western Iran. Those are the sons of Shem. And so the Hittites are going to take over the Lydian people. And for whatever reason, the Hittites don't have a lot of hard vowel sounds in the middle of their words. And so they're going to, after the Tower of Babel, that is. And so they're going to call the Lydians Lubian. I don't know why. For whatever reason, they can't pronounce hard D, G, stuff like that in the middle of their words for whatever reason. So they're going to call them Luwian. They're going to call Javan Yawin. Yawin. Same thing. The W in the middle. Why? I don't know why. But they're going to have... You're going to find a lot of L's and W's in the middle of their words. They're going to call... the city of, I believe these are descendants of Tyrus or Thracians, but they're going to call it Wulusa, which is where they get the term Ilias from, and that's where the name, the Iliad, comes from. I also believe it's where the name Helen comes from, the Hellenists, or the Hellenes, which is, you seem to have two different myths emerge about where the name, why the Greeks call themselves Hellenists. It seems to come from Wulusa or Ilias, and they're going to come up with Deucalion, which is their version of Noah, having these sons, one named Proteus, which means firstborn, one's name is Hellas, and then I think the other's name is like Athena or something like that. And then you're going to have the Helen of Troy story come, and it's clearly meant to be an origin myth for where the idea of Helen or Hellenists come from. Okay, because that was the classical Greeks, that was the main name that they called themselves, as the Hellenists. And what it probably is that the Trojans, they did take over Troy. And the Trojans were probably far more civilized than them, far more cosmopolitan in their culture, and were the main hub of probably at least transporting, like they're the main merchant class from the west to the Hittites. And so that made them basically the richest culture and probably the most sophisticated. And so the people from that culture probably spread out after that, and that's where they get the Hellenist term. So anyways, going back to the Japhethites, this is really simple. Magog becomes Mongolians. Gomer becomes the Gemarians. It's not related to Germans, even though people have made that conjecture because of German and Gomer. There might be some connection between the two names. However, there is a tribe of Persians that Herodotus counts, which are called the Germani. And if the Persians are the original descendants of Ashkenaz, or the closest ones to the Oxus civilization, the Germani might be the tribe of Aryans that migrated up here to become the Germanic tribes. They mention the Gutium, which is, they don't mention them as one of their tribes. They mention them as, that's what they call the land of the Medes, Gutium. But the Goths, when they first meet them, they call themselves Gutians. So the Gutians seem to be the Goths, which are another Germanic tribe. Again, Germanic is a broad term, but it really becomes the generic term for Aryans, so that would include Iranians too. So the proper term should be Iranians or Ashkenazis, okay? The Germanium is going to be a subtribe, but this is a common thing that's going to happen, is the tribe that becomes superior, the most dominant, becomes the namesake for the whole. And so that's why all these people here are called Persians, even though they're something like Herodotus counts like 10 tribes of people, and he's like 4 of them dwell in cities and the rest dwell in the countryside, and they're more like nomadic peoples. But the custom he accounts of the Medes and the Persians is that the people who are closest to the capital rule over the people that are further away. So there's a hierarchy of rule that starts at the capital and expands outward. So the Medes just happen to be in Gutium, and you have the Persians down here. And when the Medes take over the Persians become basically the overlords of all the other Iranian peoples here. Okay, so they just start to call them all Persians, while the Medes are a distinct people because they're descended from Madai. Okay, and so the Medo-Persians come here and they become this, and they eventually are going to team up with Nabopolassar, which is Nebuchadnezzar's father. And he comes from the Chaldeans down here in Ur of the Chaldeans. He's actually from Uruk, I think. And then they're gonna team up with also the Scythians, and the Scythians seem to be descendants of Togarma, which is another name. Who knows where they came? Some people call them the Sake or whatever, but the Scythians basically are probably out of this Andro-Novo culture, because when the Aksu civilization falls apart, basically you just have the Aryans descend into Iran and into India, and the Turks, because these are the major language families, the Turks are going to go into the north, and then Magog is going to go up into here, which, if you notice, these are all pre-existing civilizations that existed before. So you're going to have the Sumerians, the Gomerites go into here. You're going to have the Ripheans probably going up into here. And what they're doing is they're just rebuilding on top of old civilizations, but now they're divided up by language. And that's why you have these distinct cultures that are here. Because guess why? If I'm digging up an old pottery vessel or cup that these people are making here, guess what I'm going to figure out? How to make that thing. So these guys might be digging up these civilizations and then burying these people with their stuff as a way of just kind of honoring the dead, and then, you know, rebuilding on those cultures. But essentially these guys are going to become, up here is going to become the Meshech and the Slavic and the Finno-Uralic languages. These guys up in the corded ware culture are going to become the Norse, the Germans, and then Taratessos is going to be over here. The Celts are going to spread a lot of this stuff. You see where the Yamana culture is here. This is around the area where the Celts come from. And then the Celts are ironically going to go down here into, this is where the Galatians come from. And so you probably have people repeating things that happened before the flood in terms of migration. And you're going to have these distinct cultures as a result of digging up distinct cultures that pre-existed them. But this breakup is largely similar to the breakup of Japheth's descendants. And so all of these locations, the reason they're all in the north is because that's where the Japhethites were told is their dominion by Noah. And by the time they get down here into India, Iran is, except with the exception of Elam, which is right over here, this is basically an open, big, huge plateau. And there wasn't a whole lot of reason to develop this, because notice you don't see a lot of rivers here, big rivers. It's the big rivers because, remember, the way they developed before the flood, it didn't rain. It just said a dew populated the ground. And so they would develop along these big river systems where they could dig irrigation channels and expand farming. Okay? So where they're going to go afterwards and dig up cultures that they know exist are along the big rivers as well. Well, Iran doesn't have a lot of big rivers. It's basically big mountains and plateaus up here, and you see there's a few. There's one coming over here, and then there's one over here, but most of this is not. Well, the main cities that are going to develop along here are basically going to be along the trade routes from the Oxus to the Mitanni, because these people are going to keep trading with the Assyrians afterward, and then also from the Oxus towards the Indus Valley here. And so you're going to kind of have these main two highways here, and then also from the Indus Valley towards Elam. And so the main civilizations and cities are going to develop at the intersections of these big roads. which makes sense. You have this today. When we developed the highway system, I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It does have a river there, but the main reason that's the big city is because that's the main road going from Chicago all the way up to the Mackinac Bridge, and beneath it is going to be the main road going from Chicago over Detroit. And so you have Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo are going to be the main two cities that develop along the cuts between those main roads. Well, that's how it was back then. The difference is those main roads are going to be built around cities that originally started around river systems. And so these guys who have chariots and horses and carts, once they start moving, they're going to become the most dominant people because they're going to have chariots and stuff like that to take over. And they're going to be able to run roughshod around your guys who are mostly, maybe they can wield axes and spears and stuff, right? So these Aryans are going to come in through here, and it doesn't look like it's going to be this massive war or anything like that. And the main reason is because technologically, the people in the South cannot put up a fight. So when you have all these people down here in the South that are, remember, these are farming cultures, but not only are they farming cultures, they're sparse. Because the descendants of Rama and Shiva, with Ham, who colonized this place, they have all of these rivers to colonize. And what we have here, notice how we still have the lighter parts here. Before the Ice Age ends, whoops, let's put this map up here. These people are able to travel to all the way to Australia. And so did the animals. This is how the animals get trapped in Australia that aren't anywhere else in the world, okay? These animals are going to basically follow. They're going to be able to go right over the Bering Straits into America. They're going to be able to go down into Australia, but then they're also going to be able to go down here and down here. And what these are is going to be rich, fertile valleys that are watered by rivers flowing down from the Himalayas. And so they have all these places where they can expand and build farms and stuff. Well, what that's going to end up with, remember, this is going to be over the course of from 2300 to 1700, so 600 years. That's going to end up with them being the most densely populated. I'm sorry. They're the most densely populated now because they have all this rich farmland, and so they can just expand their food supply like nobody's business, okay? But in that early period, if they're expanding all the way here and they're going to expand into China, and we're going to find out one of the main islands a lot of these people are going to come from linguistically is going to be Taiwan. Well, if you see where this was back in the day, notice here's China and here's Taiwan. It's all connected by land back then. And these valleys in between would have probably been like the richest farmland. You're talking about you're downhill from the mountains and the lowlands, and these are probably rich, rich, rich farmlands that these people are spreading all over. They're planting rice, they're growing, they're having all kinds of babies. And so why are they going to stay here? The answer is they're not. They're going to keep migrating over here, and the biggest civilizations they're going to have are where all the rich farmland is, and all the stuff's connected. And between this, you have all kinds of fishing. You have tons and tons and tons of food. Okay? And so by the time the Aryans are going to come down here and descend down into the Oxus Valley civilization, the people are here. There's not a lot of them. We can tell they didn't spend a lot of time rebuilding the Harappan civilization and digging it up. And the main reason probably why is because they can't read the language. And so they can't. The reason they're in Sumer and Egypt so densely is because they can read their old writings and figure out stuff having to do with the river levels, the astrological calendar, because it's different depending on where you are in the world. They can figure out stuff having to do with how to breed cattle. All these things were kept in their records. And so they have all this knowledge of how to advance their civilization quickly based on the civilization that advanced for 1600 years before the flood. And, well, they probably have stuff like that here too, but it's in a Canaanite language, and none of them are Canaanites, so they don't know how to read it. Nama probably would have been a Canaanite. The rest of them, I mean, they could have been Canaanites, they could have been Hamites, but the point is they're not reading this script that was developed by the Canaanites in isolation of the rest of the world, okay? And so when they get here, they've got a good river system. They can build this up, but there's good river systems anywhere. There's no reason to be here versus anywhere else like you have in Egypt and Sumer, because those are the OG civilizations. And so they're going to spread all throughout here, and by the time the Aryans descend, They estimate this around 1500 BCE. This is going to be pretty sparsely populated, and they're going to have chariots, and they're going to crush. Okay, so they're not going to come in necessarily and have this big war and wipe these people out. They're going to come in as a far superior civilization. Okay, you're going to have the same thing when the Danites show up here in Egypt. They're called the Tuatha De Dan, and they're viewed as gods. Why? Because they come from far superior civilizations where these guys might be able to mine and farm, and it looks like they eat a lot of clams and they fish and stuff like that. But these people come in with armor and shields and bronze and shining stuff, right? They're viewed by these people as such a far superior culture. They're viewed like gods. The same way the Spanish are viewed when they show up to the Americas. Why? Because these people are using stone and mud, and you guys show up with swords and guns and shining metal armor. You seem like gods to them. You would seem like how we would see an angel visits us, and he's got a sword and he's got armor, and like this is advanced from us. Okay, it's like the what is Thor's family called? The Asgardians just show up all of a sudden, and you're digging in the mud, and you're like, what the heck? These guys are next level. And so these guys are coming here from this civilization that they're descending here, and they've been trading with them for a while. So there's probably some of them intermarried with them, and but they're going to come in bigger waves, and all of a sudden they've got chariots and all this stuff. They've got chariots and armor, and these guys are just next level, and so they're basically going to take over, and they're going to become the dominant civilization of this area, which is called the Vedic culture. Okay. Now, you don't want to think of India as this Vedic culture covering all of India and Southeast Asia. It's going to eventually influence all of India and Southeast Asia, but it's mostly right here on this river system, okay? And they're going to come down here, and the main two big Indian rivers is going to be the Indus here, which flows from the Himalayas down towards the Indian Ocean, and then the Ganges River here, which flows down from towards the other side of India, okay? And so India is mostly bordered by these two river systems that head down towards the Indian Ocean, and then there's a bunch of other river systems, because remember, the Himalayas is like these massively high mountains with huge ice caps that regularly flow rivers, and then they're just going to meander down throughout India, and there's actually a ton of rivers here. And so this land to the Sumerians was called Maluha, which means land of the flowing rivers. Well, these flowing rivers, as you can see, is all over everywhere beneath the Himalayas. So that's going to include China. That's going to include, this is called Indochina because it's just between India and China. And so we don't know if the land of the flowing rivers it's probably their reference for everything here. It's not just India. But the main ports they're going to get are coming from India, because that's the main river system that they can hop to from Sumer. Okay? And so most of their trade is coming from here, from ports here, and these ports are probably fed by other ports down here, like in Cochin. These are going to be major places where spices are going to come from, okay? Over here in Indochina are going to be major places that jade is going to come from. And over here is going to be a secondary source of where you can get tin and lapis lazuli from. And so these things that go into their temples and their advancing civilization are all going to come from this land called Maluha, okay? I have a theory that Maluha might still be preserved in the name Malaysia, because Malaysia is a newer name given by missionaries and colonialists who went to the region. And Asia is just a way of just saying the land of, kind of. And Malhu or Malay or whatever whatever the root word is for the Malay people could have been based on this original name for Maluhu, which makes sense because the Indus is the Aryan word for river. So the Hindus or Indus people are people of the river. And if this is the land of flowing rivers, Maluha means Maluha means the land of the flowing rivers, then Malu or Malay would mean the rivers. So they're the river people. And so these would basically just be Indo-Aryan and Canaanite designations for these people. And the Canaanites, the Sumerians and the Sinaites, are going to migrate away from here first in Sargon of Akkad's takeover. So when Sargon of Akkad takes over Kish and Shinar, and these people, remember, the leader before the guy he takes over, his name is Puzur Sign, which means protected by sign, okay? Now, our historians and archaeologists want to assume, well, Sign must have been a god back then. However, if you do the timing on it, it's like, no, Sign could have still been living. And the idea was this person was an underlord under Sign's dominion. And then Sign's going to die, and they're going to deify him as the moon god Sign in the days of Sargon of Akkad. After him, this guy, Saba, seems to be the ruler, which is going to be Cush's oldest son, which makes a lot of sense. So Sign would have probably originally colonized the area. He starts over here in the Sinai Peninsula in the wilderness of Sign. There used to be a river system that went down here and connected to the Euphrates, and so they'd migrate down here, and they'd become the Sinites. And then there's a city here called Sumeru, which is based on Zemar. There's a city called Zemaru and the city called Sumeru. One is closer to the coast and one's in the Judean highlands, but this is a Canaanite tribe from the sons of Zemar. And Zemar and Sign are the two Canaanite tribes that are mentioned in the Table of Nations, but they're not mentioned as being there when the Israelites come and take the land. Okay? Well, that's because they would migrate down here and they would become the Shinar, or these people would become Sumer. The Zemarites become Sumer and the Sinites become Shinar. Okay? And the Greek or the Hebrew word for sign and shine, the sh versus the S sound, they're not distinguished back then. Okay? So it just depends on where you're from and how you pronounce things. Okay? And so the Sinites are going to basically, remember, in their system, the priests are the rulers. And the Sinites seem to start the first priesthood, and Sign seems to be the head of that priesthood. And they're really just replicating the priesthood system that existed under the Ensis and Enki. Okay, so Enki was the priest of the earth. That's what Enki means. It means priest of the earth. Nc means priest of the city. Okay, so their word for lord or ruler really is a word that means priest of the city or priest of the earth. That's the high priest. Okay, and so by the time you get to the end of the flood, this is important, you have this word En, which basically means Lord to them, okay? You're going to have, these people are going to migrate away from here when Sargon takes over, and it makes sense. See, the Sumerian, there's a Sumerian nobility that moves up here into the Zagros Mountains that tries to make a comeback. They're called the Sumeru, that tries to make a comeback after Sargon is defeated. There is, or Sargon's empire is overthrown, and then the Sinites seem to migrate, because remember, they're trading with the Japhethites here, through here, for tin and lapis lazuli, okay? And there are probably some overland routes by this time, too, going through Iran, okay? So what are they going to do? When you go set up trade relationships with people, in a lot of cases, you're going to form a marriage alliance with these people. Their sons are going to marry your daughters and stuff like this, and this secures your trade relations with these people, so it's not just a matter of who has the best price, it's a matter of who you know, okay? And so they're going to have existing trade relationships down here and over here in the Oxus Valley civilization, and they're going to come there, and they're going to bring the Canaanite beliefs that they dug up from before the flood. So these are ideas that come from Canaanites and Sethites. They're going to bring them with them, both to the Oxus civilization and to the Harappan civilization, okay? Then you have the Tower of Babel. So this is going to repeat itself, because you're going to have after Sargon's empire is overthrown, it's going to be taken over by the Amorites, and that's Hammurabi's clan, basically. He's going to be the big king from that clan. And then after Hammurabi, you have the Tower of Babel. Hammurabi seems to start building the tower. The Tower of Babel incident seems to happen in the days of his son. And when that happens, the Sumerians down here in South Iraq, they just up and leave, because nobody speaks the language around them anymore. The Sinites have been basically taken over by the Akkadians, and the Akkadians are essentially a Semitic people. And then the Amorites are a Canaanite people, but they've lived among Semites here and here forever. So they're going to adapt to their languages, because they have all these pre-existing marriage relationships with them. But the Sumerians are basically just ruled by them, and they don't speak the language. And since they consider themselves some of the OG civilization here, and they have no means of upward mobility now that the languages have all been confused, they skedaddle. And where are they going to go first? Well, they're going to go to the place where they have the nearest trade relations. So they did have this place, you see, where This is where Oman is, this peninsula right here. There was a city called Dilmun here, and this was like a major trade post, and that was probably your halfway way station between here and here. Like they'd go around here, they could stop in Dilmun, and Dilmun could distribute what they're trading both to the Arabs towards Egypt and up to the Sumerians. So that could be a place where they could it was probably just this big bazaar where you could sell all your wares, and people would pick them up and then redistribute them for a higher price. And so Dilmun was a famous city at that time, and so they probably originally went to Dilmun, and then they went over here to India to the sources of where this stuff is. And then around this time, the Sealand dynasty starts to come up from here, which I think are either Chaldeans or another people who migrated back. But I think it's just the Chaldeans. I think the Sealand dynasty is just where they came from, and until they have the name Chaldees, they're just not called Chaldeans. And that could be some other, they don't write down where these people came from, the Chaldeans or the Sealand people. So you have the Semirites that are going to come here, and they're going to basically migrate, it seems like, and this is probably going to happen over centuries, so it's not going to be this really obvious thing that you're going to find genetically or historically, but they're going to migrate among these people, intermarrying among them, and they're going to make their way over the course of about 200 years from here all the way to the and this is my conjecture, this is my theory here. They're going to make their way, and this is the genetic evidence, to Mesoamerica, and the first main civilization they're going to become is called the Olmecs. Okay, and you have these Native Americans from up here, and you see the R1b, that is basically Western European Germanic. That's the colonizing of the Europe from here. The Nadeni people, these are Eskimos and stuff. They're related to the people who also you see the C3 here. They're going to become this mixture of Mongolian Turkic peoples as well, but they're going to get over into here. And if you know these people today, they have horses that can run across the ices here. They have these short horses with long hair that can run across these ices here. So some of these people are going to get landlocked here afterward and become the Eskimos. Other tribes are going to be sailing along the coast of the Bering Straits, and they're going to get down into Middle America. You see they're going to come in through basically what's Seattle and San Francisco and stuff like that, and they're going to get uphill from here. And they're going to have these legends of the rising sea levels where they're going to talk about a flood. And you're going to have this common myth all around here. And it's not Noah's flood. It's this secondary flood that happens after the Tower of Babel where these sea levels rise. And so they're going to talk about how their people survived by getting up to the top of the mountains and hiding in caves or clinging to trees or whatever. And then what used to be mountains were now islands. Okay? And because they're isolated in these islands, they're going to have a lot of humanity origin myths that talk about a mother and son, a father and daughter, or a brother and sister sleeping with each other to produce humanity. And because of that, these ideas are going to get back into India, and the idea that Noah and his Nama were brother and sister instead of husband and wife is going to start to circulate around here. Those same myths are going to be all the way down into the Americas, because you probably had something similar going on in the Bering Straits. Again, people running up into the mountains to escape these rising sea levels. And what were up into the mountains to them were, we would consider these lower lands now, but when the sea levels were much lower, these are high mountains to them. So they're going up to the mountains or the highlands to escape what they think is the second flood, like Noah's flood. And just like you have the story with Lot and his daughters about how they think they're the only ones left, and so they sleep with their father they think they're repopulating the earth, you have the same thing happening all around here. These people are watching what they thought was civilization vanish under floodwaters, and they think they're the new Noah and Nama. And so all around here, you're going to have these myths, and it's pretty much from down here in Southeast Asia, which is where you see these lowered sea levels used to be, all the way up into Northeast North America. There is a common legend of a flood that doesn't talk about an ark. It talks about people surviving by climbing up into the mountains, and then an incestuous relationship afterward to repopulate humanity. And so it's basically just these ideas conflated with the Noah story. You do have stories of an ark or a cask, or they'll describe it like a barrel or whatever, all the way over into here. And then the closer you get to the Mount Ararat region, the more details that are similar to the Noah's flood story you have. But you do have those similar details, like the rainbow afterwards, the sacrifice afterwards, the sending out a bird afterwards, all those things. You find those details all the way into North America too. Okay, so we know the original story was there, and then this secondary flood story kind of overlaid it, and depending on which people became dominant over time, you have you have one or the other flood story. However, what you do have among some, even Native American tribes I found, is they know that there were two floods, and they would say there's two floods, these two floods are about 600 years apart. And so you have this story, this myth of a 600-year long cycle that Josephus has in 70 AD about how, like, there's these astrological long cycles that cause floods. Okay, the original one seems to be 600 years because it's about 600 years after Noah's flood when this happens. So all of that is going to radically change the landscape here. You're going to have people isolated here that become the Aborigines, and because these were probably pioneers. Your pioneers back then were people who, just like your more modern pioneers, they could live off the lay of the land. They were roughnecks. They didn't need a lot of stuff to survive, right? They had their wits. Well, you have these people down in the Aboriginals here who know how to manage with sticks and spears and stuff like that, because that's how they pioneered the place in the first place. And then they get landlocked in here because, they get ocean locked in here because they've lost connections with most civilizations, and those are going to become your Australians. You have others who are better seafarers, and remember, the Sumerians were boss when it came to astrology. They were the best when it came to astrology, and you can read stuff from ancient India in Vedic literature and stuff like that that is very clear that they understood that the earth revolved around the sun, and that the stars were like suns that were far away, and they understood how the stars would shift as you moved across the planet, and they could use that to navigate where they were by sea. And that's why these people, who are probably Sumerians, you notice how you have sea over here, and then sea over here, and then you have O up in China, and then O all the way here, and O all the way here. That's because these are people descended from the Sinaites and Sumerites who are going to keep taking the sea routes and navigate to all these islands here. And we do have some evidence of some of them reaching South America, but because this is all mountainous and cliffs and stuff like that over here on the side, you don't have a lot of evidence of them settling it. Okay, they mostly end in Hawaii and some of these islands out here, but that's where your Maori people are going to come from in New Zealand, and these people are going to eventually come. I don't know where these other M is for Papua New Guinea. That could be a distinct people that emerged. But a lot of these people seem to descend from relationships that were very closely interbred, if not brothers and sisters. And so you're going to have whole islands of people that look the same. The whole island of people look like they're all like one guy's kids. It's really weird. But a lot of these guys, because they're moving back up into here from these super rich civilizations, they end up coming up into Southeast Asia and India from these other civilizations. As the ocean levels are rising, they just keep having to migrate upwards. And that's why this becomes the most densely populated area of the world. It's because you had these people who already had big families and were widespread, now all packed into everywhere south of the Himalayas for the most part. And then in terms of China, it's going to be south of the Himalayas here, or southeast of the Himalayas. So this is why this becomes so packed and widespread. And that is also why, if you see Thailand, which would have been the furthest land point outward, or Taiwan, this probably would have been once upon a time a major trade hub for these people, because notice it's going to be the main trade place between the Chinese and these Southeast India. So this is going to be the descendants of Sine. This is going to be the descendants of Sumer, and also Kushite peoples mixed in with them. And this is going to be probably the main. It's like a peninsula sticking out from what was once a much bigger China. And so because they used to have these lowlands here too, you see China would have been much bigger, and then these people would have all had to pack in upriver from where they are, and then they're going to be a lot more densely populated after that. And Taiwan is going to become an island, which is why this island here, we find out that there's language groups as far away as Madagascar and all the way out into here that are all, notice this O1 here, O1 all the way here, O3 right here. That O is basically a major genetic and linguistic diffusion point for pretty much the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Well, it makes sense if you understand that's the main connection between the Sumerites and the Sinaites once after the Tower of Babel, and then over the course of, say, maybe a couple hundred years, it's going to, the sea levels are going to rise, and it goes from being a big port on a peninsula like a Hong Kong or something like that to being an island. So this is why you're going to have these main people groups here that are mostly descended from, again, the sea is going to be descendants of probably a mixture of Sinaites and Mongoloid and Turkic peoples. That's why you see the Kazakhs, the Mongols, the Tungistic peoples, and then they're going to get up into here. Q is going to be the descendants of, you notice they're over here in the Oxus Valley civilization as well. You see the Turkmen is a very densely populated. So again, these are also a mixture of, it looks like, probably Sinite and Turkic peoples that come over here. So they're two different migrations of two different peoples. And then probably along the way, you see Q3, Q3A. I'm sorry. You have O and then you have Q. I would imagine the C is the Sinites and the Q are probably the Sumerians, because it looks like they come up here into the Oxus civilization to become Q. And you probably have Sumerians that go up there too after Sargon takes over and then after Hammurabi takes over, because you're going to have an existing nobility that is basically overthrown. And so their descendants are going to leave and go up to this other place again. And all the way down through Hammurabi, everyone's speaking the same language. So it would have been a lot easier to migrate back then. So that's your summary history of the migration. What you end up with here is this area here, which was once basically Ham, Rama, and Sheba, and we know this from Ezekiel 27, where it accounts all these different trade goods that are traded in Tyre. It's going to talk about the spices that come from Rama and Sheba, and that's India. Okay, Solomon would have had this navy that would head towards Tarshish, go all the way around Africa into India, and then come back into the port of, it's basically Eilat now, but it's like Aqaba right here. And it would be a 3-year journey, and they'd come back with a ton of money and a ton of goods. Okay, and they would come back with peacocks that come from India. They'd come back with apes that come from West Africa. They would come back with stuff that's from Spain and stuff like that. They were clearly circling Africa and going to India. So anyways, Ham is going to basically, his son Cush is going to be over here. That's their starting point of population. They're going to migrate along here and along here. And Kish seems to be descended from Cush and Nimrod. I don't know if Cush himself ever made it up here, but his sons, 2 of his sons, Rama and Sheba, and I think he has like 5 sons. Rama is, I think, his youngest son. Actually, let's just look at that. You have Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. So the second to youngest son is Rama, and then Rama has 2 sons, Sheba and Dedan, okay? There are 2 gods in Ethiopia, which are called Sebemeker and Dedun. Sebemeker seems to be, Meker seems to be like progenitor or maker. So Saba is our progenitor. That seems what Sebemeker means, and Dedun is Dedan. But Sheba and Dedan are seen as a pair. Seba is the Sabaeans, which are actually in Yemen. And it's also Zaba. So Zababa is the guy who Sargon overthrows. That means servant of Father Saba. Because Saba is going to basically inherit the domain after Cush probably has died and Ham has died. And Sin is possibly dead. He might still be alive, but Cush might have been considered senior. because Sin is the son of Canaan, and Cush and Seba is the firstborn of Cush. Okay? But Rabbah and his son Sheba are going to go with Ham to Dedan, and they seem to become Brahma and Shiva, the gods Brahma and Shiva, okay? So they're going to go up here. Ham's burial site is this village called Guarabal, which basically means village of the wanderer. So Ham seems to be known as the wanderer, and he seems to start out in Egypt. His wife, I suspect, came from Egypt because her name is Kemet. Kemet is basically how Egypt would say Mrs. Ham. And Egypt was originally known as the Black Land, and Kemet is basically also the name of a city where, or I'm sorry, I'm probably going to get this mixed up. It's a city where the Ogdoad is, which is Nu, Naunet, Ammon, and Ammonet. It's basically 4 guys and their 4 wives, which seems to be Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 8 who got off the ark, the 4 guys and their wives. Ham is called by the Egyptians Ammon. He is called by the Hebrews or the Semites Ham, so it's a guttural Ham. He is called by the Canaanites Yam, and he becomes a sea god, Yam. He is called by the Assyrians Aminu, and that's basically a version of Ammon, which the U at the end would be a Sumerian thing, and this Sumerian Akkadian culture is what colonizes Nineveh and its big cities. So that's why you have Amanu there, and you have Nuabu, which means father Noah, followed by Amanu, followed by Belu, and Belu seems to be Cush, and Bel generically means Lord. That's where the name Baal comes from, and that's why your Greeks hold that Belus is the father of Ninus, the founder of Nineveh. Well, that is pretty close, because if Bel is Cush, which means the Lord, and he's the firstborn of Ham, that would make him the Lord of the land. Just like the firstborn of Gomer, his name means nobles, the nobles. Okay, so you're going to have Belus, the father of Ninus, founds Nineveh. So essentially, that's Cush, the father of Nimrod, founds Nineveh, and that comports with what the Bible says. The Greeks seem to get this from the Assyrians, not from the Bible. So that's very important. And then you going up into here. Ham is basically, it looks like his wife's going to die, and I'm going to assume that this city is where he buries his wife. That's why it's such a prominent place, and it has the names of the 8 on the ark, because Ham's wife would have been a prominent part of those original 8. And that's where Egypt gets his name, the Black Lands. And so I'm going to assume that Ham is, generally speaking, where your yellowish-skinned people come from, and his wife, Kemet, is where your black-skinned people come from. Which means, does that mean the original Egyptians were black? Well, Ham's wife was black, and that's probably where Cush gets his black skin from. Because if Kemet means the Black Land, and it also means Mrs. Ham, seems like she was black. And so Cush, being their oldest, makes sense that he would share his mom's skin trait, right? And so the Egyptians were more like, again, these are the descendants of Mizraim, which is one of Cush's other sons. They have more of like a reddish copper tone skin, and this is going to play very prominently as we go forward. So we want to assume that these people very early on were marrying in with each other, which means they had descendants who probably had more darker toned skin and descendants who had more copper toned skin. And this is going to come into play in the caste system later, okay? So remember, we've got Egypt and Cush. Rama and Sheba are descended from Cush and probably from a wife that came from Egypt. So they're going to be producing black skin and more reddish skinned people. Sin is going to be a descendant of Canaan, son of Ham. And he also seems to have descendants that produce more reddish skinned people. And they're known all the way over here as having come, the Native American, some of these legends would say that the red people came here and brought culture, which is basically they moved to the south and brought culture, they would say. So that's your Mexicans, essentially. Your Mayans, your Aztecs, your Olmecs, people like that seem to have brought the culture from the Sumerians over here. And the Native Americans remember them as being distinct and having more reddish skins, because your Native Americans, remember, they're going to come to dominate. And so that's why your Native Americans all have reddish skin. But they're in more ancient times, they probably had whiter skin that was more of a combination of kind of like your northern Chinese, kind of like a combination of Japhethite and Sinite genetics, and so they would have had more white and yellow skin. But as these people knew all the farming and they produced more people and their cultures dominated, eventually all these people to the north of them would intermarry with more of them, and they'd all have more reddish skin. Okay? So, in India, meanwhile, back at the Batcave in India, Ham is going to start out in Egypt. He's going to start out up here. You're going to have the Amorite cities that they seem to be unearthing here, and then he's going to go down to Egypt. That seems to be where his wife is buried, and then he's going to settle here near Heber, which is a grandson of Noah. And it seems like he takes another wife here, because there are descendants of Ham that are listed in the Judean highlands between where Heber would have been and where Melchizedek would have been, okay? So it makes sense. Ham's wife died. Where's he going to go after his wife dies? He's going to go hang out with his brother Shem. Makes sense, okay? Remember, Ham himself is not cursed. It's Canaan who's cursed, and that's at the end of the life of Noah. This would have been still while Noah was alive. And he's going to take another wife. Well, where's his wife going to come from? Probably from a descendant of Shem through Heber, which is why he's based right in that area, because he probably has family relations there. And typically what's going to happen with these guys, when they take another wife, they're not going to take an old lady. They're going to take a young woman, and then start having a whole bunch more kids. Remember, these are people who live to be 600 years old. So when they're 200... they're like middle-aged. They're like a 35-year-old to us. And they talk about these people like the youthful ones. They call them the youthful ones. Why? Because they don't look old. They're obviously prime. They're obviously wise. They're obviously rich and connected, but they don't look old. So who wouldn't want to marry them, right? So Ham's going to get another wife here, and he's going to have some descendants of Ham here, and then he seems to go over. By this time, Canaan is doing his thing here. Canaan is producing Nephilim within the generation that Noah dies. That's why he's cursed. So Canaan seems to be producing Nephilim over here. He seems to be digging up the Sumerian civilization and reconstituting its religion over here. So this is more like the occult. Nephilim production was kind of like Sethite occult to try to fight back against the Canaanites who had better weapons, basically. And then over here, this is going to be a mixture of Sethite and Canaanite stuff that's going to involve Nephilim production. It's going to involve weapons. It's going to involve divination having to do with the fates and stuff like that, because this is how the Canaanites justify going to war. And so all this stuff is getting reconstituted by the Canaanites, the sons of Zemer and Sine, who probably helped them excavate Egypt and find their stuff too. So they're probably involved with the resurrection of the Egyptian religion as well as the Sumerian religion. Ham's going to go over here, and it seems to be he gives Cush the authority over all of it, which is why Kish is named for him, and that's the capital. And their history is going to say it was always the capital going back to before the flood, which there's probably some truth to that. They're probably reconstituting the old government where it once was under the dominion of Ham, and he's appointing it to his firstborn Cush, because he's going to go take Cush's son and grandson and go over here and colonate here. And what they seem to be doing, and I'm imagining Canaan to be with them in this, Canaan seems to be the explorer and the archaeologist and the navigator and the occultist. And so Canaan, this is why Canaan is cursed. He wants to know everything from the pre-flood civilization. He wants to know their gods. He wants to know their occult stuff, their sciences, and he becomes basically the first wizard. Wizard just means wise man, okay? Sage, philosopher, all these names are just names for this wise man. Magi, that's another one, or Magian or magician, comes from the tribe of the Magi, who were the wise men of the Persians. But Canaan is basically the first wizard, and Ham seems to be supporting him doing this. Ham doesn't seem to be putting a stop to it, which is why Ham does not receive a blessing, and Canaan gets a curse at the end of Noah's life. And so I'm imagining Canaan coming with him, but we don't really know. There's no burial site for Cain. There's no obvious god that seems to be based on Cain, except there is a god among the Indians, which is a much later god called Kanapu, which seems to could be Pu, like father Canaan. It could be. Canaan in Egypt seems to be based on the earlier Canaan that is the son or grandson of Seth, because Seth is also among them. So that doesn't seem to be based on this Canaan. So we don't really know what happened to Canaan. But what I suspect is that the culture of yogic meditative practices and the super occulty Hindu stuff originated with Canaan. So I suspect that Canaan probably died in India. But I don't know. And we know probably his son Sign and Cush. We don't know if he died here. We don't really know, but he could have. It doesn't seem like he did, though, because there's no reference to him or anything in the theophoric god names or anything. There is a Belus there, but there's no reference to Cush dying. We have a Ur-Zababa, we have a Sign in the theophoric names, so we know Sign and Saba were significant here. Cush probably founded the city, but we don't know where he died. Could have died up here. Ham died up here. And so you're going to have this pre-existing Hamite Cushite connection, or Canaanite Cushite connection from Sumer to the Indus Valley, and that's going to remain for, Shem, Ham, and Japheth would have probably, assuming none of them died young, they probably would have died somewhere around, let's see, flood is 2300, 1800 BCE, about 100 years before the Tower of Babel, okay? By the time they die, most of the next 10 generations are dead. So in the century immediately before the Tower of Babel, you have Ham die, Shem die, Japheth die, and then all these other great youthful ones who had lived to be, anywhere from 200 to 400 years old. Okay, so all these people are dying that were rich, famous, prominent, influential, and the father of tons of people that live on the earth. So it shouldn't be shocking at all to have a whole bunch of gods pop up when the Tower of Babel is a century later, and they're going to have a bunch of different names. Okay, and that's what you have in India. So, but what we want to look for in India is a version of Noah, a version of Adam, a version of Enoch, a version of Tubal-Cain, because these are the main people who are famous in the Bible. And what it makes sense is that what Genesis 1 through 10 is either Yahweh explaining to Moses why these people are so famous, which is why he's accounting the names they are, or this was an oral history that everyone once remembered, because it's not a long record, okay? And so if everybody once remembered, and again, if I can almost memorize, I pretty much can memorize the Table of Nations and Genesis 5 and all these names. I almost have it completely memorized, and I haven't put a ton of effort into it. Guys who live to be 500 years old or 200 or 300 years old definitely can, okay? So the idea of memorizing the story of Genesis 1 through 10, like verbatim, which is basically takes you down to the Tower of Babel, okay? Or Genesis 1 through 9, I should say. It takes you down to the cursing of Canaan and Shem and Ham and Japheth, like the end of their story before you get to the Tower of Babel, okay? Everybody would have Genesis 1 through 9 memorized. It would just be such a common story that they have heard told over and over and over and over and over again from Noah on down, and they all had it memorized. So you're going to look for these main people like Lamech and Cain and Tubal-Cain and Abel and Ham and Shem, Ham and Japheth and Noah in all their legends. You're also going to go, well, Noah's wife is not specifically named. The Jews conjecture that it's Naamah, and I probably agree. Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives are not named, so we're not going to find names for them. We're going to find, like you have in Egypt, Ammon and Noah are the main two that are known in Egypt. And so the clearest names are Ammon and Amunet and Noah and Naunet, which is them and their wives, okay? All the way over here in Egypt, we're going to look for Adam. We're going to look for Tubal-Cain. We're going to look for Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're going to look for possibly Canaan and Cush, Rama, and Sheba. We're going to look for them and see if we can find them. And the answer is we do find them in the Vedas, okay? Now, the thing you need to know about the Vedas is the Vedas we don't have them in written form before, I think it's like 1000 AD in Sanskrit. That doesn't mean they were never written in another language before that. That's just what we have available, okay? Now, the Indians were rather isolated from the West by the Muslims, and then before that, the Persian Empire. We know they have scripts going back to the time of the Persian Empire. But what we don't have is a long history of India having a big unified kingdom where those scripts could become standardized for a long time. And so they don't have a long history of a writing tradition that is shared across India. Okay, what you probably had is some scripts. The scripts that they had seem to be affected by Aramaic. Aramaic seems to influence it. And that's around the time of the Persian Empire, and they're using a modified form of Aramaic script as well. And then you're going to have other alphabets and stuff that are going to emerge based on a combination of Persian, Greek, and later Muslim influences. But India has a ton of languages. I mean, it has I think 4 or 5 main language families, which makes perfect sense because the people who are first in India, you have Ham, Kush, probably don't have their own language families. Rama, Sheba, Sin, Zemar, and Ashkenaz. So it makes sense you have 5 language families. This is going to be your northern Vedic language family. Rama and Sheba is going to be your Dravidian language families. They're probably closer related. And Sin and Zemar probably have languages that are blends of those with Canaanite phonemes and grammatical structure and stuff like that. So you basically have 5 main language families, and then a breakdown after that, and a whole bunch of different dialects. And I think they have 4 alphabets. So these language families were very distinct. The continent was never a united continent. Probably the closest thing to it was I think the Maurya Gupta Empire, which is after the Persians rule, and they basically break away under the Greeks, and you have Maurya Gupta and Ashoka and guys like that rule, and they're going to try to nationalize Buddhism and Jainism, but you don't ever really have a unified India or something close to a unified India under the Brahmins or the who bring in Vedic and ultimately Sanskrit as their script. Okay, you don't have a unified national culture under this language, and so what you have is this priesthood who are known as songwriters. Okay, this priesthood who basically writes songs to honor their gods, and it's out of the era of the Persians and the Greeks that they try to come up with a more systematic theology for understanding their cosmological worldview. They probably had some of that orally before that, but they didn't have it written down. It's certainly not in the Vedas. We don't have anything about the caste system or reincarnation, or we do have the idea of Brahma as a first principle, he's a god who is also the highest idea. So similar to the Greek logos or the nous, which is the divine mind or the highest principle, the highest idea. So their God is more of an idea. Their most high God is more of an idea than a person. Okay, but it seems to be based on Rama. The Aryan Pir means old man or master. Rama would be the name Rama. So if somebody is saying it, remember this is being said for literally thousands of years before it's written down. Parama. Okay? Now if that goes from being a person to an idea, typically the names are going to end with an A. You're going to have an N at the end of it. Okay? So Brahman becomes the name for Brahma. And Brahma, you're going to find it there. But there seems to be a priest that inaugurated this religion, and his name is, he goes down as the name of a god, Brahmanaspati, which basically Pati seems to be Lord or POTUS. Remember how N means Lord. It's a name for priest, but it also means Lord. Brahmanaspati basically means the Lord of the principle of Rama. That's what it seems to be, okay? And I know there's going to be people who are going to be no, you can't do that with their etymology, blah, blah, blah. And I'm I'm going to call bullcrap because you're talking about thousands of years before it was written down. The idea of a Brahma coming from Purama, which means old man Rama or master Rama, makes a lot of sense. And Aspati means lord of the principle of old man Rama, is basically a religion that they testify to their main progenitor, which is Rama. The religion, so the principle of Rama might not have been originally the deified form of this guy reduced to a principle, but actually the law of Rama. So if the Lord of the principle of Rama could literally be, or the Lord of the principle of Master Rama could literally be the name. And again, this is an Aryan Vedic transcription of something that they're accounting as a god. Okay? So what they're getting from probably this Kushite core that they're kind of taking over is there was a Lord of the principle of Rama, or basically like the law of Rama. Brahman would basically be the law of Rama, okay? Old man Rama. And they're writing it down as the Lord of the principle of Father Rama, or old man Rama, is or Master Rama is basically their high priest. Deified, okay? And we have very thorough evidence that they're deifying the high priest, just like the Sumerians did. It makes a lot of sense. So check this out. If we're looking at the Vedas, and we're just trying to go like, we know these were written down probably around 1000 AD, but we can conclude pretty clearly that they're based on songs that were very, very old, going back to as far as 1500 BC. They probably weren't all going back to 1500 BC. They probably evolved over centuries, and they also picked up new gods, new hymns, and stuff like that as this priesthood expanded into different cultures with different patriarchs, different gods, and different languages, okay? And so as this Aryan culture is taking it over, remember, the Vedic language, the Indo-Aryan language is the dominant language, but it has its subgroups and derivatives too. So that as they're taking over these areas and they're incorporating these other gods, you're going to have some variation in these hymns. There's not a ton, but I haven't come anywhere close to reading them all. I just basically perused this, and I can tell you there's probably a handful of phases where there's new gods, or, you know, in different regions, different gods that are more prominent, okay? But if what I did for my analysis is I just counted how many times each god's name is used, and you can tell which probably the oldest and the OG and where they come from. And it's pretty simple when you break it down, okay? So of all the gods in here, okay, remember, I've counted how many all their names are, okay? I break it down to priest gods, bull gods, storm gods, sun gods, serpent gods, types of gods, and then basically the top gods and the lesser gods that are still quite prominent, okay? The number one by leaps and bounds in terms of his references is Agni, okay? Agni is Enki. All this is, remember, this was after the Tower of Babel, the Sumerians and the Kushites who are over here, they remember Enki, which is the main god who is considered the high priest of the pre-flood world. That's Enoch, okay? They're going to mix up Enoch with Enosh, who's the first high priest, okay? And so Agni, I find all of these hymns about him, and they say that he was established from birth as a high priest by Manu. The U at the end is a Sumerian thing, and Man is the, just means man. It's literally saying the man, which is how you would say Adam, okay? So Adam is Manu, and the first, what they're doing is they're conflating Enoch, which is Enki, and Enosh, which means the priest is established in the Old Testament as the same person. And so they would say that Anu established, and this is in multiple songs, so it's not just conjecture from one. Manu establishes Agni as the high priest, okay? So they're very clearly calling him a high priest, even though they're worshiping him as a god by this time, okay? But yet they have hymns that say he's the high priest. Well, he is going to be called a high priest, and the priests under him then they're going to call him Angiras. So notice how it says Angiras. Notice how it's changed over. So it's not Agniras, it's Angiras, okay? This is going to be really important because when we get to Zoroastrianism, I want to make sure I might have said it wrong. Yeah, so the Angiras are in here 1,000 times. So notice how the N and G are flipped over. Well, we have the same thing with the Egyptian language among the Greeks, which are Indo-Aryans, okay? They're going to transliterate the K from Kopt or Keftu or Kipt to a G, and that's where you get Egypt from. So all you need to do is change the G with a key, and you've got Enki, okay? A's, obviously, A-E-I-O-U's can shift over from long A, short A, and blah, blah, blah between those languages. So Agni, somehow it goes down as Agni. Well, this is actually a pretty simple thing. So think about how African Americans will say, remember, Indo-Aryan is English, and they say the word ask. And then African Americans, for some reason, keep saying ax. They say the opposite, okay? Why? It's really simple. It's not because they're stupid. It's because in their language, that their language groups are descended from, and this is somehow like, I don't know how, spiritually solidified in the Tower of Babel and how their languages were distinct. In their language, it is much more common to see an AKS than an ASK. In Indo-Aryan languages, an ISK is common, like Tobolsk, right? It's the original root word for ish or isk, okay? And so ask is something that we pronounce all the time, because if you were to say that person is Danish along Indo-Aryan languages, you would say Danesk or something like that, okay? So esk is a common thing among Indo-Aryans locked into their language. In African languages, you have ask, is they pronounce ax, but think about this. The capital of Ethiopia is called Aksum, okay? It's much more common in their languages to have AKS or like KS in terms of those words after each other. You're going to see similar things in Southeast Asia. It's like the name Nguyen. If you know of any Vietnamese people with the name Nguyen, it's a very common name. It's pronounced Nguyen. That's how it's pronounced, because it's Nguyen, okay? It's actually an NG at the end of the word, Nguyen, and that's how it's pronounced Nguyen. And in Indo-Aryan languages, we put NG at the end of words, but never at the beginning. And that's a common thing to them. So to be able to say it to them and them hear it as you pronouncing it right, they're pretty impressed with that, because we don't do it. Most people just say win, like W-I-N, when it's win. And pronouncing those reverse syllables and stuff like that is a shift from language to language that just doesn't make sense. So we have in the Angiras, which are the priests, the true order of it, which is Enki, okay? And then in the god that gets deified, he gets deified as Agni. Why? Because these are differences between Indo-Aryans, Canaanites, and Cushites, okay? So the original priest is Enki, and he's appointed by Noah, a priest from birth, and because they got him mixed up with Enoch and Ensi, but the order they have matches with the Bible, because they say that the guy whose name is Vivasan, which is the father of Yama, which is Ham, was the seventh priest from Agni. Okay, so if you count from Enosh to Noah, not counting Enosh himself, Noah is 7 later. He's the seventh if Enosh is the first priest, which means in Sumerian the priesthood is established, go down 7 later and you have Noah. And they talk about Noah as a guy who married his sister, and this is Shem's father. Or this is Yama's father, okay? So this is important. The name they have for their Noah, and again, they don't associate with him with a flood. They do reference a flood, but the flood seems to be the second flood, because they describe it as basically the god Indra, which is their storm god, destroying this serpent god, and it causes this flow to flow down from the Himalayas, basically. So what they're describing is the second ice age, the second flood after the ice ages end. Okay, that's also where they get the idea where Noah's a brother and sister from that other myth. And then the idea of Indra slaying the serpent obviously goes back to Indra is actually a sun god and a storm god originally. He's eventually going to become a storm god as Mithra replaces him, but he's originally a sun god and a storm god who's known for serpent slaying. He's Yahweh, okay? So he's also called King of the Gods, okay? So the idea is he's Yahweh, he's the most high of the active gods on the earth, Okay, but there's an idea of a transcendent God that is beyond him. That's his father. Okay, and so he is considered a son. He's also considered a sun god. He's also considered a storm god. And he's considered the serpent slayer. Okay, so we have the top gods thoroughly identified. Now, Noah is going to have this name Vivasan, and this same thing is in Zoroastrianism as well. This is Indo-Aryan as well. He's called Yama Vivasan Son in multiple hymns, whereas the Gathas, which is Zoroastrianism, call him Yima, the son of Vivasant. And in the Gathas, he's the bad guy. He's the guy who they have him doing something like the Noah myth and describing him saving the best of all plants, animals, and stuff like that in caves from an ice age. Because remember, their mythology is based around this ice age melting that happens after the Tower of Babel, okay? This is also going to come into Norse Germanic myth as the giant Ymir, who, when he is killed, there's a flood from his blood. Why? Because it's about a century after Ham dies that this secondary flood happens, okay? So Yama, he's called in some versions Yarna, but the main name is Yama, is Ham, based on the Canaanite Yam. Okay, he's a sea god over there. Why is he a sea god? Because he's somehow associated with this second flood. This second flood seems to happen not long after Ham dies. Now let's assume Ham lived to be the same as Shem. Shem is going to die around. Noah's going to die around 1850 BCE, because the flood is 2300. I'm sorry, the flood's 2300. Noah's going to live 350, so 1950 is going to be when Noah dies. Shem is going to die around 1800. If Ham lives to be around the same time, he dies around 1800. The Tower of Babel is going to be around 1700, but these receding ice ages leading to the raising of the sea levels probably happened around that same time. And so it's going to go down in their history as a flood that happens at the death of Ham. It starts happening with the death of Ham, okay? And so you have Yima, the son of Vivamant. You have the giant Ymir in the Odin myth, where they're going to talk about him having 3 sons that killed the giant Ymir, and then whatever, the bull is going to lick this giant free from a block of ice, basically. Okay, so why is all this stuff in here? The name Ymir, the Yima, and it's related to an ice age. It's because this ice age seems to end with all this water coming down from the Himalayas, mostly among other places, but towards the south it's going to be towards the Himalayas, and the Himalayas means Ham's abode. The Aryans are going to come there and say the word Haim to them is going to mean snow, and so there's going to be called abode of snow, but it actually means abode of Ham. That's what it means, okay? Let's see. Yami is a twin goddess. I believe it's like the wife of Ham. That's the name for it. And then they're going to say Yama's mother is the spouse of Vivasan, which is Ham's mom's the spouse of Noah. He also is going to be, because he's accounted as the first man to die. Well, what he really is the first old man in India to die. Okay, and he becomes the king of hell, and they call him this Yama or Yami is a king of hell, and this myth travels all the way to Japan. So Yama is the king of hell. Why? He's the first one to die. From the perspective of these Indians, after the Tower of Babel, he's like their Abel, okay? And so he becomes a mythological god of the underworld, okay? So let's see. You have, in Zoroastrianism, their demon, their version for Satan, they have 2 names from Angramaynu and Ahriman, okay? Ahriman is in Hindu as Aryaman, and Aryaman just means noble man, okay? Well, why is he demonized as Ahriman? Well, the noble man are the invaders that came in and made war and took over. But Zoroastrianism seems to just be an inverse of Hinduism. They seem to be competing for being the national religion of the Persian Empire, and so they seem to just be opposites of each other. So I think most of Zoroastrianism was made up during the Persian Empire. I don't think much of it existed except for the fire rituals and some really basic stuff before the Magi tried to make themselves the national religion of the Persian Empire. So Ahriman is just basically means nobleman. Okay, so that's literally the Aryans, and this he gets deified as a god, Ahriman. Okay, which is probably based on Ashkenaz. He's the nobleman. And Agni is established by Manu, and so they have this other version because this is also their existing religion that was there. And remember, the Agni's priests are called Angiras, and Agni was established by Manu. So Agni of Manu produces the priests called the Angiras, or the Angiras of Manu. So another name for the devil is Angra Mainyu. Why? Because they're demonizing the priesthood that pre-existed them. Okay? They're the Brahmins, and they're coming in to replace that priesthood. And what they end up doing is saying that Agni, basically they make it like how Jesus is the priest offering up sacrifices in the heavens for us. That's how, Christianity kind of develops that. And the idea is they make Agni or Enki the priest in heaven, doing the heavenly version, because they have the immaterial, material version of everything. And Agni is the heavenly priesthood, and the Brahmins are the earthly priesthood. And that's how they get the Indians to basically subject themselves to the fact that they just overthrew their priesthood. Okay? Your priesthood, the priesthood of Agni and the Angiras, is in heaven. Our priesthood is on earth. Well, that is really convenient because you rule everything, see? And the highest caste among them is the priesthood, okay? So they took over the system that they had of priest rulers and put it in their place, and then underneath the priests is going to be the warrior class, which are basically their enforcers, okay? So the guy who does this is this Brahmanaspati, seems to be Lord of the Brahmin principle, basically, Lord of the law of Rama, okay? And that's how he becomes the de facto high priest of the new era after the Aryans come in, okay? And then let's see. Agni appoints him as a priest. He's the seventh from Adam. Vivasan means growing life. And the reason I know Vivasan means growing life is this. They say Vivasan means something totally different, like all the gods or something like that, because there is a term Visva Devas, which means all the gods. And so they think Vivasan means something similar, but actually Matarasvan, or notice it's Vivasvan, Matarasvan, okay? Matarasvan is a name for, another name for, it's something related to Agni. I forgot to write that down. But I looked, and etymologically it means growing in the mother. So it has to do with somebody. It might be Agni because he was born a high priest. And Matarasvan seems to be maybe a deification or just a word that talks about his, almost like John the Baptist being chosen while he's still in the womb, stuff like that. Jeremiah being chosen while he's still in the womb. Agni or Enki seems to have a similar disposition, okay? And so Matarasvan means growing in the mother. So Vivasvan, Viva just means life, means growing in life, which makes sense because if you look at what Noah is called among the Canaanites in Sumer, you have Zeusudra, which means he who has found life in Sumerian, but it also means God of the flood in Indo-Aryan, or shining one, divine one of the flood. And then in the other one is Utpatneshim from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which means he who has found long life. So it makes sense that you have a version of him where the Canaanites have influenced them called, again, this is going to be translated into Indo-Aryan, growing in life. Why? This guy lived to be 900 among other people that are shrinking steadily after that, okay? So, Zivasvan goes down as the father of Yama. He's the seventh priest from Agni, which is a conflation of Enki and Enoch, or Enosh and Enoch. And then we have this guy named Rudra, which means the red one, and he seems to be their god that is based on the father of the Nephilim. He is called a bull of heaven. He is also, his youths are called young Rudras, and they're called Maruts. And the young Rudras are known as demon slayers. It says they are born together of themselves, the men of heaven. So in other words, these are descendants of heaven versus on earth. It talks about them. This says, stirring the darkness with lances and spotted spear, combined as priests with serpent's fury through their might. So it seems to be they're like overthrowing the land before that. We know from the pre-Canaanite Harappan civilization, we have a version of Adam, the Lord of Animals, with bull horns on. They also have a bull god, and this seems to be the same stuff that's in the Canaanites of Sumer. It has to do with worshiping the bull of heaven, the father of the Nephilim, and then his sons are called young bulls, and divine youths, young ones of Rudra. Rudra means red one. We don't know exactly why Rudra means red one. I think possibly Rama's son, Sheba, could have had reddish skin if he was married to an Egyptian. And so if Rama is Brahman, remember, Pir Rama means old man or master Rama. Rudra's name, the modern Indians say that's Shiva. Okay, now Shiva is not mentioned by name in the in the Vedas anywhere. Okay, there's a lot of very popular Indian gods that are not mentioned there by name at all, like Shiva, Ganesh. A lot of these gods are going to come later, and they're probably based on other descendants and tribes, kings that eventually get absorbed into the Brahmanic system, and that idea of absorbing these new gods into systems seems to go from the time the Indo-Aryans take over all the way up into the time of the modern era. There's gods that are not written in the Vedas anywhere that Indians are like, oh, that's another one of these gods and these gods and these gods. The other guy, and he is considered the father of Vivasan's wife, is Tavastar. Tavastar, I believe, is based on Tubal-Cain. He's a forging god. And then he makes a bull. It's called Tavastar's bull, and that he probably was one of the first guys to invent crafting idols of bulls. And Tavastan is actually, I believe, a conflation of Japheth with Tubal-Cain. And the Greeks call him Hephaestus. And it seems like the Indians, remember, there's a lot of similarities between the Greek and Indo-Aryan language that's in India. And also the Greeks are going to rule over India at some point in time, okay? But it seems like they were traveling and sharing ideas with each other going from way, way, way back, like pre-Babel, okay? And then they eventually become separate peoples, and then they eventually, what you're seeing happen with the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans is all about trying to, who is going to take over the Japhethite sphere, okay? And let's see, Shavastar, it seems to be, remember, Shavastar and Hephaestus seem to be the same person. The Greeks are going to add US, so you have Hephaest and you have Tavasht. Tavasht and Hephaest seem to be the same person. They're both they're both gods of the forge, and the name seems to be derived from Japheth. Japheth is Hephaest, and Tavasht. That seems to be just different. You know, again, this is more a Germanic, Persian, Indo-Aryan version. This is more a Greek version that is probably influenced by other languages as well. But it seems to be a conflation of Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain was the sister of Nama, and if Nama is Noah's wife, it makes sense that they've got them closely related because they're memorizing an account that talks about the last two people it talks about from Genesis 10 or Genesis 5 is going to be Lamech, and then that's the wrong Lamech, sorry. This is Genesis 4. It's going to talk about Tubal-Cain, and it says the sister of Tubal-Cain was Nama. Okay? If Nama is Noah's wife, it's not a huge jump to go, that's his daughter, not his sister, because those would be the names they remember in order. Okay? But it's actually Tubal-Cain and Nama are both children of Lamech. So again, if they once had this memorized, that's not a huge leap. Again, no, she's going to also go down as a sister of Noah, and a sister of Tubal-Cain is going to be her father, which is just a mix-up. Tubal-Cain is actually her brother, and Noah is just her husband, and they're not related. But they seem to be trying to make sense of this myth of people starting over with incest, this corrupted version of the flood that emerges after the secondary flood throughout Oceania, throughout the whole area surrounding India. And that's probably why the Yima myth is there in place of Noah's Ark. They probably forgot Noah's Ark and instead remember an ice age followed by a flood. And this is why this is so important. This is why your modern academics in the Anglo-American Germanic sphere, which is all Aryan, want to push the idea of the flood myths being based on something that happens after an ice age rather than based on what the Bible says. These national groups have been historically, since the 1800s, anti-Bible, anti-Semitic, and trying to prove that the Aryan myths and legends are older than the Bible. Okay? That's been a major thrust in their academia, which is basically a cult trying to prove something. And so that's why they have these ideas of ice ages dictating the flood narratives versus a secondary ice age after a flood, which is the truth. Okay? So we have that. There's your number one god, the Angiras and Agni covered. The next god, and this is not always listed as a god, so that's why you have such a high count. Soma is basically an intoxicating beverage they use that is based on milk, water, and a plant that produces ephedra. Okay, so ephedra is basically a plant that stimulates the effects of adrenaline. And so this warrior class that's descending down from Oxus seems to be taken up with this ephedra root. And it seems to grow in the mountains around there, so it makes sense that somebody discovered it, probably the Canaanites, because the Canaanites have all this medicinal lore that they dug up from Egypt and Sumer. Okay? And so they discover the ephedra root, they create this drink, and this drink becomes an intoxicant that they use to connect with the gods and get their divinations and stuff like that. Okay? So what they're going to do is they're going to convert the normal sacrificial ritual, which you have Noah doing and Abraham doing and Job doing, this normal sacrificial rite of just offering up sacrifices to God and thanks with him, right? They're going to turn this into this ritual of communing with the gods by using Soma. And so the priests, who also are the people responsible for writing these songs, they're going to drink this Soma beverage, and it's going to get them drunk, and it's going to also be used by their warriors, and it's going to make them very focused, very energetic, and very horny. Okay? So these guys are going to basically be spreading their seed around, kicking butt in battle, and acting like they're divinely inspired. Kind of like Saul is prophesying with the prophets. Well, these guys are doing the same crazy stuff that the Brahmin priests are doing to get their divination. So they're going to be seen as these like godlike semi-divine beings among the people they're invading. Okay, so Soma is going to start out as a beverage, and then it's going to be deified as the Lord of Warriors. Okay. It's also used by the priests. We know the priests use Soma. We know the Greeks use Soma. The Zoroastrian religion is going to, you can tell, kind of speak against intoxicants, but I think that probably came later as a adjustment for Islam, because Islam was anti-intoxicant. Okay, so that's the second most covered thing. Another name for Soma seems to be Amerta, but this could be a different beverage, but it seems to be the same thing. And again, this is the idea of it's an intoxicating beverage that becomes the god itself. Just like Agni is going to be the high priest, but he's going to become the god synonymous with the sacrificial fire itself. So these are common things that you find among Indo-Aryans too, is taking objects and personifying them. The Egyptians are going to somewhat do that too, but they're more taking people and making them the god of different primordial forces and stuff like that, where these guys are taking things and they're making them the fire. So that's how Brahman is going to become the first principle, even though he's a person. Agni is Enki. He's going to become the fire god, even though he's a person. Soma is the beverage that they introduce, and that's going to become a god. And then the next highest one is Indra. Okay? 891 times. So you see half as many as Agni. Makes sense. Agni's Enki. He is very, very old school from the antediluvian perspective. Soma is the people writing this religion. Take that. So it makes sense. That's going to be very high up there. And then Indra is going to be one of the first gods that emerged. And Mithra and Indra are the main versions. When the sun god and the storm god become distinct, their names are going to be Indra and Mitra. Okay, and we know this has happened by 1400 BC at least, because we have this treaty. It's called the Supaliluma Shadizawa Treaty, which is basically between the Hittites and the Mitanni. And it talks about this treaty that's going to go over, and it mentions all these gods that are shared. Remember, the Mitanni is a combination of Japhethites and Aramaeans and people from Ur, so they're called Hurrians. The Hittites are a combination of Japhethites from the Ionian sphere, the Semites from the Luwian sphere, and Japhethites from their north, and then the Canaanite Hittites. So they have these languages that are Shem, Ham, and Japheth originated, and then they also have all these gods that are Shem, Ham, and Japheth originated. And so we see these generic terms for the storm god, Lord of heaven and earth. Notice the storm god is considered the Lord of heaven and earth. The moon god and the sun god, the moon god of Haran, heaven and earth. The storm god, Lord of Kurunu of Kabat, the deity of herds, Kurta, so that's a god probably of a herdsman. The storm god, Lord of Uhusman. So they all have different versions for the storm god after the storm god appears to Job. This treaty would have been written probably maybe 300 years, between 300 and 400 years later, okay? Iasari, Lord of Wisdom, and Iasari is another name for Enki. Anu, which is a deified version of Noah. Antu, I don't know who that is. Enlil and Ninlil, that's obviously the original Sumerian version of the Father and the Holy Spirit. And then we get into these Indian gods that are right here. The Mitra gods, which is plural. The Varuna gods, Indra, and the Nasatya gods. So the Nasatya gods are the Nasatya or Asavin twins, or Nastia twins, which seem to be based on Shem and Japheth overthrowing the Akkadians. Indra seems to be based on, remember, these guys are in a mixture of Hurrians, which come from Ur, and then Japhethites, which are going to be spread between Oxus and Urartu or Armenia, and then Semites. Okay, so Aramaeans and the Naram, descendants of Naram Hebrews. Okay, and Indra seems to take the N from meaning, which generically means Lord, and then Udra, which seems to mean flow or flood. So remember how Zeusudra can mean God of the flood in Indo-Aryan. Well, Indra can mean Lord of the flood in Indo-Aryan. Okay, so Indra is a single god, but he is also understood in the Vedas to be both a sun god and a storm god. So it's their version of Yahweh. The Nasatya gods seem to be based on Shem and Japheth, and again, this is a few hundred years after their death, but deifying ancestors is common among all of them by this time. The Varuna gods, Varuna seems to be a Vedic version of the word that's going to become Uranos to the Greeks. Remember, the Greeks add the US at the name, okay? So Varuna or Runa is going to be a god that is basically means the heavens. So this seems to be their version of the Heavenly Father, so it's just the God of the heavens. So if you look at who are the main gods that are testified among the Japhethites, it literally is like if Mitra, I believe Mitra is based on the Hebrews who are among them. Remember, they're intermarrying with the Egyptians, and the Egyptian forefather is called Mitzrayim. Okay, the way, if you were to say in Hebrew Egyptian, if you were to say the Egyptian Ra, you would say Mitzri Ra. But the Jews were known for taking out those middle vowels so they can shorten a word, and so it would be Mitzra. Just like Amraphel means Amar, Raf, that's face, El, Amraphel, okay? Amar means he said. It's a way of saying so-called. Just like they say about Jesus, he says don't write he's the king of the Jews, write he says he's the king of the Jews, okay? Well, the way they would say that in Hebrew is saying so-called king of the Jews, in other words, is to say Amar, and then Melech, I don't know the word for Jews, Judaios or something. Amar Melech, he says he's the king of the Jews, okay? Amraphel means he says he's the face of El. He says he's the face of God. Well, that's Naram Sin, who claims to be a god, okay? Mitra seems to be, because remember, before this treaty is written, you have a space of about 150 years where these guys are intermarrying in with the Israelites of Egypt, and Joseph, who is the chief of all that, is married in with the priesthood of Ra at An. So the idea of the Egyptian Ra, Mitra, it would just literally be, to Hebrew, Mitz, M-I-T-Z, Ra, Mitra, okay? Mitra is transliterated by the Japhethites, Mitra, okay? Varuna, so you basically have the sun god, the Egyptian Ra, and Indra becomes separated to them as a separate storm god. But remember, the original Indra is a sun god and a storm god. So it essentially is a version of the Father and a version of the Son. And then a version of Japheth, and Shem. So the only thing missing here is a version of the Holy Spirit. So we're looking for a version of the Holy Spirit, okay? So if we look at their other gods after that, so Varuna basically means the heaven, the Asavin twins, this is how it's pronounced in the Veda, but other versions are Nastia twins, and like guys like Castor and Pollux, these divine twins are always based on Shem and Japheth. The Hindu version of them has one of them being white and one of them being brown-skinned, because it's Shem and Japheth, okay? So after these gods, remember, these gods were in this treaty, so we know these gods were very prominent by this time. So we have Indra, Varuna, Asvins, or the Nastia twins, and Mitra, okay? And he is called in the Vedas both Mitra and Mithra, okay? But combined, there's about 336 references. The next one, remember, we're looking for a version of the Holy Spirit. We have Vayu or Vata, and we have, between the two names, we have about 200 references, okay? Means wind and air and life breath, okay? It is masculine. This is the first and only in the ancient world version of the Holy Spirit that I have found that is specifically masculine. And again, these words, but we see the same thing in Greek and Latin, okay? In Latin, the word for the Spirit is masculine. The word for the Spirit in Greek is neuter and usually translated masculine, okay? But they mean the same thing, wind, air, and breath, okay? So Vayu or Vata it means wind, air, or breath, okay? So this is their version of the Holy Spirit. And so, again, all I'm doing is just counting these gods by mention, by number of mention. Vatu Avaya is also considered the first to consume soma. This is one of their references, okay? So Vatu or Vaya is a masculine god who is associated with the first to drink soma, which is this intoxicant these guys are used to basically feel like they're getting into a spiritual trance. Makes sense, okay? So if we just get these top gods, and these are all the gods that have over 200 references, okay, 200 and above, and we basically have Enki or Enoch, Soma, which is their intoxicant beverage, Indra, which is the Lord as the storm god, Varuna, which is the heavenly father, the Asvins, which are Shem and Japheth overthrowing the Akkadians, Mitra, which is the sun god version that comes from Egypt through the Hebrews, it seems like, Vayuvata, which seems to be the version of the Holy Spirit. And most of these are just, with the exception of Mitra and Indra, which both seem to be, the names themselves seem to be influenced by the Mitanni Hurrian culture, which is that mixture of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Most of these names are specifically, or Agni is also a transliteration. Most of these names are basically Indo-Aryan terms, or Indo-Aryan transliterations of terms that come from Canaanites, Hebrews, or Cushites, okay? Or Hurrians, which are basically Canaanites as well. So, after these gods, these are people who are mentioned quite a bit, but not nearly as much. And this suggests that these gods came later, okay? Aditi is basically a version of a god that represents the expanding heavens, so space, okay? So this is amazing because I believe Job references God expanding the heavens, and it's in the prophets. But the Hindus seem to have all this astrological knowledge, which I suspect come from the Canaanites. They seem to know that the sun doesn't set, but the earth actually just turns toward and away from it, which I think the Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, knew too, because the word laylo, which means night, seems to mean to twist away. Okay, and then they seem to understand that the space is expanding, and they have the idea of it being expanded by a god. Now, the Bible does say that God stretches forth the heavens, so they seem to be taking that function and making it a separate god. So Aditi seems to be the god who's expanding the heaven. And because they believe that human beings ascend and become stars when they die, they seem to understand that stars are suns, okay? And that the space is expanding. And because these people believe in an expanding universe and a never-ending cycle of stuff, they probably believe in like new worlds and new heavens and stuff like that, okay? So Aditi means spanning space, and so the star gods, the ones who ascend to become suns or stars, are known as Adityas, okay? So just like Angiras are the priesthoods of Agni, Brahmins are the priests of Brahma, Adityas are their ascended masters, or people who die and become stars, okay? And this is reflected in the Dingir and Sumer. You have a star symbol next to the god's name once the human that dies and they believe he's ascended to become a star, okay? After that, the next one is going to be Brahmanaspati, which makes sense because this is the priest who's introducing this new religion, the Lord of the principle of Old Man Rama. Okay? The Lord of the principle of Old Man Rama is basically the new high priest. The Angiras, the Agni and the Angiras is basically their throwback priest from before the flood. And then out of that, you have the name Brahman, which is the principle of Old Man Rama, which is the name probably for their religious code or law, which becomes personified as the god Brahman, okay? And also the songwriting priests are called Brahmins, just like the priests of Agni are called Angiras, the priests of Brahmanaspati are called Brahmins, the principle is called Brahman. And again, this is their religious code that is turned into a god. Okay. Beneath that, you have Vishnu. Vishnu, when I'm researching this stuff on academic sources and on like Wikipedia and stuff like this, they all seem to say like the main gods are Brahman, Vishnu, and Brahman, Shiva, and Vishnu. Shiva is not mentioned in the Vedas at all. This is why they're saying Rudra is Shiva. And Vishnu is only mentioned 114 times compared to all these other gods, which for the most part match the gods that are in the Supalima treaty. So if this was written in 1500 and we have a treaty from the 1300s that lists four of the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4 of the top 7 mentioned gods, okay? It lists 4 of the top of them, but it doesn't list Shiva. Neither of them, nor is Shiva in there, nor is Vishnu is there, but it's a much lesser deity. Then this idea of Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma being the top 3 gods is a much later development. That's what I would suspect. I think the top god was always considered Varuna, and Indra was considered his son, and Agni was considered his high priest in the heavens, so he's ascended to be the heavenly priest. Soma is the induction beverage. Mitra is when Indra's sun attributes get divided from his storm attributes. It becomes the separate gods Mitra and Indra, but those are imports. Vayu or Vata is the Holy Spirit, and that's been like that, for a while. But again, it turns into a masculine deity because the word itself for the spirit in Indo-Aryan is masculine or neuter, which fits with why everybody in Christendom thinks that the Holy Spirit has to be masculine. Why? Because their words for the spirit are masculine or neuter. Doesn't matter. The Bible is a Semitic book and theirs is feminine. Let's just reconcile whose language this was written in first and reconcile that the Japhethites didn't come up with Christianity, the Jews did. Okay? So, the Adityas is basically just ascended masters. That's pretty simple. Chavaster is Tubal-Cain. Hephaestus, Ahriman seems to be a god based on the nobleman coming down, so it's probably based on Ashkenaz. Vishnu, yeah, I don't know who Vishnu is. I don't know. I could try to figure that out, but I don't know. And then Sindhu is based on the river. There's this myth of Sindhu. Sindhu is just a personified name for the Indus word for the river. And the story is that Indra slays the dragon or the serpent, and then it breaks into these 7 rivers, which become the major river systems of India. Deus Pater, which is only referenced 38 times as Deus or Deus Pater, just means divine father, and it just seems to be a newer Indo-Aryan version of Varuna, which is Uranus. Okay, because again, Uranus would probably be like the Varuna gods. Remember, Elohim is a plural. So if you're saying the God of the heavens to a Hebrew, it's gonna the word is plural, so it's gonna seem like gods of the heavens. Okay, so if they take off, remember they call them the Varuna gods. Well, that's the heavenly gods. Okay, and you just reduce that, then you just have heaven, the heavens. And this is why some people will say Zeus or Deus means the heaven or heavenly, and it doesn't. It means shining one. Tiwas means shining one. That becomes Deus, Zeus, Theus, Teus, all of them. Why Uranus means heavenly, and that's why the god Uranus is the god of the heavens. And he's considered the highest one, followed by Kronos, followed by Zeus. Zeus is the shining one, and that's their version of Yahweh appearing shining in the garden. That's why he's the sun god, and then he also has the storm god attributes in Greece. Okay? So after these gods, again, you have the serpent god. Oh, I'm sorry, he's mentioned 292 times, so he's up there. So the serpent, because this is the other one you want to expect from Satan, is got to be mentioned a lot, and he is mentioned 292 times. Okay, this is the main name for the serpent. I don't know what Virta means. I haven't done a etymological study on that. But it's obvious he's the serpent. It's Indra and the serpent, and they are locked in conflict. Ahi is another name for the serpent, but it's only used 11 times versus the other. So we have this idea of him slaying the serpent that is throughout. But again, if you know the primary lore of this priesthood is coming from the Canaanites of Sumer, you see that all the way over to Mesoamerica, and now we see it in India too, the sun god, the spirit god, the heavenly father god, and the serpent god. And then the sun god becomes the storm god. We see the exact same thing among the Olmecs in Mesoamerica as we see among the Hindus in India. That's not a coincidence. It's the same Canaanites spreading the same religion around. And it just so happens that the Hindus are going to come after that. The Vedic Aryans are going to come after that, and they probably have their system corrupted by the Sinaites as well. So I'm going to assume that these people aren't just straight up Aryans, but they're Sinite Aryans, and they become the Indo-Aryans, and they become the dominant priestly class. Let's see if there's any other gods that are of note. Surya is 200 times. That's just another word for the sun. Surya just seems to be their word for the sun or shining one. Mitra seems to be an import from Egypt. That's why they have tons of these sun gods. It's like the current Hindu pantheon has like a dozen sun gods. Okay, well that's because they're imports from different places. Vivasvan is considered a sun god. That's Noah. Bhaga and Paranja, I don't know who those are. Vishnu, I don't know who they are, but they're counted as sun gods. Pusan is a god that is known as the prosperer, the one who causes you to prosper in prayer. So he is a god that pokes you with a goad or an awl and tries to get you to pray. Savitar seems to be based on a word, something like savior. Surya seems to be a word that means like shining one, or the sun itself. Mitra seems to be an import from Misra. Varuna seems to be the heavens, and Indra seems to be Lord of the Flood. Okay? But they're all listed as sun gods, and then they call the sun gods as a group Adityas. That's a type of god, shining one, okay? But these are essentially ascending masters, people who, basically they believe died and became a star, kind of like Enoch getting raptured, okay? Anki would have been the first, the OG, but he's associated with the sacrificial fire versus the sun or the stars. Manu is Adam. Agni, we said that. Agni and Angiras, the bull gods. Indra is considered a bull god. But this just seems to be the common Sumerian, depiction of a god wearing bull horns. Okay, so Indra seems to be a bull god. Vishnu seems to be a bull god. And Rudra seems to be a bull god. And the Maruts are the use of Rudra. So Rudra seems to be the bull of heaven. Reduces the Nephilim. The other ones are just considered gods, and so they're depicted with bull horns, and then they have hymns about them being bull gods. Okay, because Indra's a sun god. He's a sun god. He's a storm god. He's a bull god. He's just their version of Yahweh, and so of course he's going to have the most attributes applied to him, and the most songs written about him. Okay, and that's the other thing too. When you see these like 1973, and it's not like they have this many psalms written after them. The whole corpus probably is somewhere around 1,200 songs. But some of these guys is their name is over and over and over again in the song. So what you're seeing when you see these gods a lot is you're seeing songs written exclusively about them or almost exclusively about them, or lots of songs being written about them. Okay. Other ones you're going to see grouped together commonly. So you're going to commonly see Indra and not Mitra. I have to think about that. I think it's Indra and Vishnu that are seen together. There's a pair that's seen together, and I had written down about it. It's in my book, but it's like Indra and Rudra, I think, are commonly together, which makes sense. That's kind of the head of the Nephilim, and then the Lord. Okay, those are seen together. But I think it's Indra and Vayu are seen together, which makes sense. Those are based on the Lord and the Holy Spirit, and so they interact down in the creation together. And so you're commonly seeing them as a pair. You're also commonly seeing a quartet of, I think, Indra or Varuna, Mitra, Vayu, and there's somebody else. Oh, Sindhu, the river. And the river seems to be associated with the serpent as well, because it winds like a serpent, and it's supposed to be from the slaying of the dragon. You have this serpent-like river winding down Egypt. And so that quartet, which you're also going to find in Mesoamerica, they're basically considered a mother, father, and two brothers, which is kind of like what you have with, Thor and Loki, right? They're brothers, but they're conflicting with each other. This idea of conflicting brothers, along with the two twins that save the world, are basically Japheth and Esau, and then versions of Yahweh and the serpent as like dueling brothers who are just, sibling rivalry kind of thing. But you're going to see these terms where it's going to be like this God, this God, this God, get this God, and then it's going to say earth and is in heaven, and it seems to be reflecting like on earth as it is in heaven at the end of their prayers or hymns. And that seems to be their worldview. Again, you notice most of these gods, like if I wanted to count gods that were there less than 50 times in these 1,200 songs, there's dozens more. Okay, so this is where the myth of India having the millions of gods is. Okay, well, the reason there's a myth of them having millions of gods is by the time the Greeks and later Englishmen are interacting with their system, the way they make sense of their system, what your Middle Easterners and Egyptians and your Greeks are going to do with their gods as they multiply is they're going to create divine pantheons, which are basically divine family trees. Okay, so all they're doing is they're taking these gods that are originally derivative of ancestors, which they know, and then they're forming them in family trees, which are corrupted based on politics and who's in charge and who's making the family tree. Okay, the Indians are going to do something different, and this seems to be because this stuff emerges in the era of the great systematic theologies forming, and I'm talking Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Taoism, all the Greek philosophers. These systematic theologies start to form. The Hindus come up with a principle, and they borrow from Egypt the transmigration of souls, which the Greeks do too, and the Taoists do too. And then they make basically these gods who remember how I tell you how some people would overlay gods onto old gods? And so, like, for instance, Marduk is Amar Utu, so it's basically the Amorite god overlaid on Utu to become Marduk, and then he's a storm god because the sun god eventually has storm attributes, and they pretty much stop worshiping a sun god in Babylon. They just worship Marduk, the storm god. Well, you're going to have the same thing in India, and rather than saying, they'll say, Rudra is Shiva, and the Indians will believe it, and the academics will just take it as gospel that it's always been like that, and everybody understood that, and not like somebody just came in and bootlegged their ancestor Shiva over this. I mean, this should be really easy. Like, just think about Indo-Aryan languages and think about the V's and B's and W's and V's and stuff like that, and you're going to find a lot of va sounds in your Aryan languages, okay? Ashkenaz just sounds like Persian language. But anyways, these guys are going to, instead of saying that this is the father of this person and this is the son of him and create these crazy pantheons, like you have the pantheon of Hesiod that has two versions of Japheth in it. One is Hephaestus and one is the Titan Ipetus. And they're both based on Japheth, and Japheth becomes the slayer of this serpent god that begins with a T. I forget what the name is. Those guys are going to create these elaborate family trees of the gods. These guys are just going to say that the gods are avatars of them. And so what they do, it's their way of shrinking, because remember, there's so many languages and so many patriarchs among them and so many gods among them. And then these gods are reorganized in these different districts by different versions of this Brahmanic priesthood. And so these other people are going to come along thousands of years later and say, oh, that's because that god is a reincarnation or an avatar of this god. And so that's how they stack gods on top of each other without necessarily getting rid of any of them. And they'll say, oh, Rudra is Shiva. And they would be like, oh, that's somebody who's an avatar or an incarnation of Vishnu. And that's how they come up with the reincarnation version of where these gods are and why there's so many of them, and basically eliminate them down to the main gods that have, the most popular cult worship, while maintaining that their system was ancient and original, and it's always been like that. And to me, it is so retarded that academics are going to come in the 1800s while they're critical of everything Christian, and they're going to claim that these people, they always understood that Rudra was God Shiva, and they'll find like these gods like from before the flood, and they're like, oh, that's just Shiva, as if like the Indians just knew that was always Shiva, and everything a Hindu says is to be taken as gospel. It makes no sense. And of course, the Hindus are now trying to say that their society is like thousands of years older than the Sumerians. And I have this on the authority of an Indian who became a Christian. She literally said, Indians lie like they breathe. Okay? I can tell ya, having been to India a couple times, there's a lot of just fake it till you make it, BS, scams nonstop, people ripping each other off nonstop that goes on in the culture, including the Christian culture. Okay? This is a culture of people who are descended from Cushites, Canaanites, and Aryans, and they're just now trying to put themselves on the world stage as, academically credible and like this. But these claims of how old this stuff was, they knew that their hymns and stuff were very old. But the idea of like this being an original language that descended from the Indo-Aryans from 1500 BC as like a complete canonized religion, that came out of theosophy. And that came out of modern academics and then was spread around by theosophists as if their analysis of these songs and hymns, like, don't get me wrong, there is some analysis that you can do and be like, hey, these gods are here, and then all of a sudden these other gods appear in these other songs. And we don't really know. I mean, there's 10 books of songs, and some are probably older than others, and you can kind of tell by the existence of some gods that are Agni's just all throughout it, which makes sense. He's based on Enki. And then other gods are going to start to appear later and less often. So it's like, okay, well, these are probably later gods, later editions. And there is a point in time where they stop making new songs. Okay? And then they keep singing these old songs. But we don't know that this was a unified religion and everybody had the same songs. It was probably a bunch of different versions of the Brahmanic priesthood that was all around the north of India, pretty much the north half of India. Because the Vedic Indians rule all the way down to pretty much like Bangalore, which is the bottom almost the top 2/3 of India. The Vedics are going to rule to a certain degree, and all the empires and the philosophies that come after them are going to be rooted in their ideas. And then when you get to the same period that the Jainism and Buddhism are forming as basically systematic theologies and moral systems that are derivative of the Brahmanic priesthood, the Upanishads are going to be written, which are going to be a kind of like a philosophical, speculative version of Brahmanism. Okay, that's kind of like the conservative version, where the more reform versions are going to be Jainism and Brahmanism. Well, you're going to have the same thing happen in China, because you're going to find Lao Tzu write the reform version of the Chinese faith, which is going to incorporate reincarnation, and it's going to incorporate ideas that probably came from Zoroastrianism, like the light and darkness, the dualism of light and darkness. And then Confucius is going to write the more conservative version, which is based on the traditional Canaanite religion of ancestor worship and fate, basically. And then the Buddhists are going to come into China too, and they're going to influence China. And there's going to be these contests over which systematic theological version of the ancient traditional faith is the most valid. You're going to have the same thing happen among the Greeks, where you're going to have basically the different philosophical schools do the same thing. And what they're trying to do is create a systematic theology based on their old pagan beliefs. And the way the Greeks do it, and the way the Hindus do it, is by allegorizing things. So they allegorize things by saying, oh, Zeus is not a literal guy wielding a lightning bolt. He's a principle of this kind of emotion, this kind of deity, this kind of authority. And you're going to find this in the Hesiod, where it's like all these gods are literally just named after passions and stuff like that, or day and night and primordial forces. And this is how the world of Persia, by the time you get to the time of Daniel, Persia is going to pretty much run everything by the end of Daniel's life. And so what you end up having is these major religious sects that are all forming. Siddhartha Gautama is Buddha. We know he is from the, he's not from the priestly class. He's from, there's the ruling class of the Egyptians. So the class descended from the warrior class, of the Hindus. I don't know who the father of Jainism is. I haven't studied that as much yet, but Lao Tzu seems to be a traveling wise man who travels to Sogdia, which is basically the Chinese trade with Sogdia. And Hermes Trismegistus just seems to be a pen name for the Egyptian version of this. And then Pythagoras is the Greek version, and him and Thales of Miletus, Thales is more the physical philosopher. He's more the religious philosopher. He is going to travel to Egypt and then to Babylon, where he claims, or people who knew him claim he learned, for instance, the Pythagorean music of the spheres and stuff like that from the Zoroastrians, who have 7 in everything. Okay? Makes sense, because Zoroaster, if the dating is correct, and this is dating that according to the leading scholar on Zoroastrianism, which is this woman named Mary Boyce, who's now dead, the Magi themselves say that Zoroaster lived around 558 BCE. Well, Daniel would have been in Judah from around 600 BCE to, he probably would have died in Susa. Let's assume he died around, let's say 70, that would have been 530. So if Zoroaster was the head of the Magi under Daniel, he could have been up under Daniel for as many as 30 years. Okay? And he could have been a young man under Daniel who learned the Magian faith as well as the Hebrew faith, as well as stuff that came from Egypt and other places. The point is he's a syncretist. And he is building all this stuff together, and it's after him that the Magi, remember, Daniel's going to live until Cyrus. Cyrus is going to be a syncretist. He gives honor to Marduk. His son Cambyses is going to be a syncretist. He takes part in the Apis bull cult among the Egyptians, and it's after that a Magi tries to overthrow the throne. And then that Magi ends up apparently dying or something, but the throne goes to Darius the Great. Well, Darius the Great's father's name is Vishtapa, which is the exact same name as the guy who supposedly was convinced by Zarathustra to spread the Magian faith around in Bactria. Okay, this is their legendary Zarathustra of Bactria, who comes later. Okay, well, it just so happens that you have Darius the Great is going to be somewhere around 50 years after the death of Daniel, I believe, because I think Cyrus is going to take over and rule for like another 25-ish years, and then his son for another dozen years, and then Darius the Great's going to take over. Okay, which means Vishtapa, who would have been the father of Darius the Great, would have been contemporary with Zoroaster, according to the Magi's own calculation. And that seems to be when the Zoroastrian faith becomes the national religion of the Persians. Remember, the Magi are a Median tribe, and we know from Herodotus and from Daniel that seems like to be that the Magi were consulted to interpret dreams both by the Babylonians and by the Persians, and by the Medes. But the Persians aren't related to the Medes. They're both Japhethites, but that's it. So when Cyrus takes over, Cyrus and Cambyses, they're not really about this Magian religion. And then it's when Darius takes over, who's basically like, he's descended from a cousin of Cyrus. His father, Vishtapa, seems to be the one who convinces him, you need these Magi, this Magian priesthood, on board if you're really going to hold power over a unified Medo-Persian Empire, basically. And so he's going to go down in history as the Vishtapa who was convinced by Zarathustra to spread Zoroastrianism, supposedly originating in Bactria. Why are they picking Bactria? Because that's where the Japhethite Aksu civilization is based. And so there's going to be multiple versions of Zoroaster. There's going to be an Armenian Zoroaster, a Babylonian Zoroaster, a Zoroaster of Bactria, and supposedly a Zoroaster of Libya. This is all recorded in Arnobius, which is a pagan philosopher who becomes a Christian in the 3rd century BCE, or 3rd century AD, I'm sorry. But he's recording this from older sources that seem to trace back to this Cestian and others who seem to be in the days of Artaxerxes II. Artaxerxes II is the grandson, the great-grandson of the Xerxes who's married to Esther, the grandson of the Artaxerxes who is Nehemiah is his cupbearer, and he is going to start a version of Zoroastrianism. First of all, it was never monotheistic. There's no evidence of that prior to Islam. There's just no evidence of that, okay? When the Darius the Great honors Ahura Mazda, he calls him, he gives honor to Ahura Mazda and the other gods that are, okay? So he's clearly acknowledging Ahura Mazda as the Most High, but not as the only God. Then Artaxerxes II, which is going to be basically his great-grandson, great-great-grandson, I think. I think it's the great-great-grandson, okay? He's going to build a temple in Susa to a triad of Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and Anahita, which seem to be a version of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, okay? The Jews have a very similar cult in Egypt, and these Jews who have the cult on Elephantine Island were placed there by the Persians. And they're going to honor Yahu, which is a version of Yahweh, Anat Yahu. Remember, theirs is called Anahita. Anat Yahu, which seems to be a version of the Holy Spirit, based on a merger with Anat, who actually seems to be closer related to Ashtoreth. And the third one is going to be... I forget. Oh, Mir. No. I don't remember exactly who it is, but it's a version of the sun. I don't remember the exact name for him off the top of my head. There's also going to be a version of this in Armenia, which is going to be Orasmes, which is Ahura Mazda, Anath, I think, or Anahita. It's a version of Anahita. And then this other guy named Vaughn. They do have a god named Mir, which is based in Mithra, but Vaughn is the storm god version of Yahweh, who is known for slaying the serpent. Okay? So it's very clear that they're spreading around a syncretic faith based on study of the Old Testament and Proto-Indo-Aryan myth that probably was made by Zoroaster after studying under Daniel. And that's why you have a feminine Holy Spirit God, which it's going to merge in different places with basically Ashtra. You have a masculine Father God, which is Ahura Mazda, which means Lord of Wisdom. Oh, that's the other thing. This other God, Anat, in this other one, becomes associated with wisdom as well. And Anat and Anahita seems to be, what are the three? There's Artemis. Anat seems to produce Artemis, the original Anat, which is Hanat of Mari, and Athena. That's what one of these versions of is. It sounds more like Athan or something like that, and that's where Athena seems to come from. So Athena is the goddess of wisdom. They seem to be bootleg versions of the Holy Spirit. And this faith, again, the central arbiter of these religious ideas seems to be Zoroaster. He's also obsessed with sevens, which are all over the Bible. Well, this actually works really well among the Japhethites because Japheth has 7 sons. And you have this Vedic, one of these hymns talks about the ancient 7 sages, okay? Well, the 7 sages are probably the 7 sons of Japheth. Because these are going to be, again, after Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the next people in this Indo-Aryan world are going to be the Japhethites, and there's 7 of them. And they understand that there's 7 very old people who also would have lived to be around 400 years old. And they're called the 7 sages. Well, the Greeks are going to come up with a version of this called the 7 sages, and they're not going to agree on who they are because they're going to say, essentially these are these 7 wise men. They're going to count Thales and Solon, who basically is the guy who starts democracy. And I think some of them count Pythagoras, but I think they're meant to be 7 sages before them. But nobody agrees on who they are because the idea of 7 sages is just coming from Hindu legend. Remember, the Greeks run all this. And they're basically trying to backtrack, because the Greeks love to bootleg other people's stuff, backtrack the 7 sages to their own wise men instead of what they probably originally were the 7 sons of Japheth. And Zoroaster is going to have the 7 spheres and stuff like this, and this is going to be based on the Sumerian idea of the sun, the moon, and 7 visible planets. And the 7 spheres is basically going to become that, if you all sing that song about the music of the spheres, that hymn that says, this is our Father's world, da 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 da, and then the music of the spheres, that comes from Pythagoras. And according to one of his students who was a musician, he said he learned the 7 spheres of musical tones and stuff like that from Zoroaster. And Zoroaster taught it to Pythagoras. Pythagoras taught it to this other musician guy who's going to be listed in my book, but I forget his name. And then it's eventually going to get taught to Plato, and that's how it's going to get into Christianity. Meanwhile, back at the Batcave, Zarathustra of Bactria seems to be based on a rebellion of the second Vishtaspa. So remember, Vishtaspa's father's name is Darius. He has sons. One of them is named Xerxes. I'm sorry, and then Xerxes has sons, and among their names are a Darius and a Vishtaspa, which makes sense. Those are his father and grandfather's names, right? So he's got a son named after his father and a son named after his grandfather. Another one's going to be Artaxerxes. Okay. According to Greek sources, Artaxerxes kills his father, Xerxes, which would be the one that married Esther, and this actually makes sense. He also seems to kill his older brother. And he seems to set up this Artabanus, who is basically like, I think he might be a eunuch or a magi or something like that. But he sets up this other guy to take part in the killings and then kills the guy, saying, I caught this guy killing my father and the one who would have been the successor to his throne, his oldest brother Darius. I did the math before on how long this would have transpired, and if Xerxes would have married Esther right after losing his battle at Thermopylae, he's already put away his wife, now he's getting a new wife and he feels better. It's going to be about a dozen or so years after this, which means Esther probably has a daughter by this time. It was customary for the Persians to marry a young lady as soon as she has her period. The royals would. And the idea is for them to be able to produce as many sons as they can. The Persians had a lot of pretty interesting customs. They were one-woman men. In terms of wife, they might have had harems of other women, but they only had one wife. Okay, this is why Amestris, who is the lady in Esther, but by her real name, is the wife who gets put away. But she also has 7 sons with Cyrus. Or no, she has like 7 kids. I think like 3 or 4 of them are sons. Cyrus is going to marry this young girl, and by the time this young girl would have been old enough to have a daughter who is of age, who probably he would have married to his firstborn Darius, and then he would have had essentially 2. They would have been half brothers, half brother, half sister, so stepbrother, stepsister. They would have been on the throne of Persia. However, it's around this time that Artaxerxes kills his older brother Darius and kills his father. So we don't know what happened to Esther. We don't know if she had a daughter for certain, but it was more than likely that his older brother was going to marry in with a Jewish half-sister to continue the throne of Persia. And because of that, Amestris, her mother, was probably able to rally the Magi and other nobles to say, hey, they're corrupting the throne. We need to take this over. And that's what leads to Artaxerxes getting on the throne. When that happens, you have his brother Vishtaspa, who's out here in Bactria, ruling. And he seems to be launching a rebellion to try to take back over the kingdom under his own dominion. And he loses. Again, we don't have good recorded history, but we know he loses. He's probably killed by Artaxerxes. And it's probably out of this movement of his overthrow that the Zarathustra of Bactria is invented. And it's the idea of a purified Persian religion, because this Persian religion here is very much syncretized with Judaism. The evidence is abundant when you look at the Jews here on Elephantine Island, and then you look at the inscriptions of Artaxerxes II. They have they clearly both worship a triad that is similar. They're syncretists, and they're synthesizing a religion from Judaism and probably elements of Sumerian, Babylonian paganism, and elements of the existing Indo-Aryan religion, which is mostly based around, the sacrificial fire. That's mostly it. It's mostly just a sacrificing religion, but they treat the fire as like divine, just like the Indians treat Agni as a god. And it's the Magi who seem to be the priesthood of that among the Medians, whereas the Brahmins are among the Hindus. And by this time, remember, these people are the Persians and the Medes are anti-idols. The Indians are all about their idols. And these people are smash idols. Actually, Xerxes is known for destroying people's temples and stuff like that. Okay? So these guys whose religion is mostly ideological and mystical, but not idolatrous in terms of having graven images and stuff like that, also has many less gods, even though it does have multiple gods, sees this version, which is also controlled by India, the Indus Valley, Pakistan, as basically a corrupted version of their original Japhethite faith, which is much more idolatrous, much more pagan. And so out of that, what you're going to have is this purer form of Zoroastrianism that seems to be not monotheist, but hedging closer towards that, with just those main gods, again, Mithra and stuff like that, Mithra and Indra being the main gods that are associated with it, which makes sense. Those are the OGs. While this religion, full of evolving gods, is going to eventually compensate for the pushback against it by adopting these systems of reincarnation and how these gods are just avatars of other gods, and there's really only the handful of few gods that originated with the Japhethites. That seems to be what happens. Now, I'm still got to study stuff in the Upanishads and Jainism and Buddhism to see if I can find evidence of that theory to back that up, but that's my basic theory right now. And again, all this stuff happens. Remember, they say Zoroaster among the Magi lived in 558. Mary Boyce, who is the leading scholar, literally her reason why she doesn't believe that is she basically says the Magi didn't have any concept of time or history before the Greeks showed up, which I think is incredibly stupid, because we know the Babylonians do, we know the Assyrians do, and they're serving as priests among the Babylonians. It's just incredibly stupid to think they're that dumb. They're also the known astrologers. So why would they, if astrology's all originated around calendar and timekeeping systems based on how the heavens move. So the idea that these people didn't know how to keep history, but yet they knew how to keep astrology, and they knew when Jesus' star appeared in the sky, is just dumb. Okay? So Mary Boyce seems to be a woman who basically was the daughter of missionaries, or a family that started out as missionaries to Calcutta, who gets involved with the Zoroastrian communities and actually lives among them and stuff, and thinks that their religion is so famous and OG. And she goes on to study at Oxford. What was it? Oxford, maybe Harvard. Berkeley was one of them. And she's very clearly just a secularist and not a Christian, and probably she's a missionary kid who probably despises Christianity a little bit, because she wants to just take everything the 20th century Zoroastrians are teaching her as if it's this gospel and it's original and it's never changed or morphed over time. And she's made comments to try to push it back as far as the 1700s BC. And that's what I was originally listening to when I thought that Zoroaster might be the original Canaan or whatever. That's what I thought, because the name Zoroaster means seed of the star, or star seed. But it doesn't, people say it means sacrifice to the stars. No, it means Zara or Zara. It means in Babylonian, Semitic, Hebrew, Assyrian, seed. It means seed, like the sun. Okay. So seed of the star. And I thought it might be Canaan. And because she had these postulations that it's 1700 years old, and Avestan comes from like 1500 BC, and it's that old, and there's just no evidence to back that up. Avestan is a script that was written in after 1000 AD, and it was obviously influenced by a combination of Persian and Indian scripts. It was obviously like their gods and myths and legends were influenced by a combination of Zoroastrian gods that go back to the 1300s, Indo-Aryan gods that go back to the 1300s, but very heavily influenced by Hindu gods, that it's basically just, it seems like wherever it finds an opportunity to make good evil and bad good, it does it. And that's why you have the word devas, which becomes devils. It's actually just a more Aryan version of the word Deus or Devas. Okay, Devas is Devas, and which just means shining one, which is their term for a god. And the Zoroastrians make that the word for devils. That's why we have in our Bibles devils, demons, or devils. Okay. The Greek word is daimonis, which is actually a word for the idol itself. It's, the idol being infused with the, soul of a god from Egypt, not the term for the shining ones or devas. Okay. But the English word devils is based on the word devas, when in fact the word devas would have originally meant gods or angels. Okay. But they're going to take the word asuras or ahura, and asuras, I'm trying to think, Angiras of Manu is where Angra Manu comes from, and so they're going to say Angra Manu they're basically making Adam the devil. That's what they're doing in their confusion. Asuras, I don't remember. Oh, Asuras seems to be based on Surya, which is their word for sun, and so or shining one. And Asuras, they seem to use that word to mean Asura means their version of a shining one or a god. And then they take the word for Devas, which is based on Deus, which is actually a later version that comes from, again, this seems to originate with the Hittites, and then it spreads around from there. Tiwis, that becomes Deus Peter, Father God, seems to be Devas becomes demonized by them. That's as far as I've taken that. Again, I needed a brain dump to kind of just process, say it out loud. How does that sound? And what do I need to make sure to note and dig a little further on in my book? But that's where I'm at with that. I basically, the way I see Hinduism and Zoroastrianism, and I'm welcome to hear people, conflict with this, but they probably won't unless it's on a secular channel. is they both seem to be syncretic religions formed of mixtures of ideas during the Persian Empire, and so are these other religions that are popping up all around. Again, the Greek philosopher cults. Remember, Pythagoras is the first to call himself a philosopher. Hermes Trismegistus seems to be a pen name. Siddhartha Gautama is a guy who was a prince of an area in Nepal, and Lao Tzu seems to be a philosopher. Confucius says he met him. Okay, so these guys seem to be the main ones who are spreading around, along with the father of Jainism here. And what you're going to have here then is competing systematic versions of this popping up in the different spheres as people are getting ideas that are shared among them from merchants that travel across the Persian Empire. So we know Herodotus is doing this. This is where he gets a lot of his stories and myths and legends from. We also know that just the Jews, and I'm just going to use this as an example, there's these people called the Mizrahi Jews, okay? The Mizrahi Jews, okay, it literally means Egyptian Jews, okay? Well, we know during Cambyses, which is just the second ruler of the Greeks, a garrison of Jewish people are put here. We also know from extra-biblical Jewish stuff from the Second Temple period that Jewish armies fought as mercenaries under Nebuchadnezzar, okay? So when they were conquered by them, their armies didn't just go into stop fighting. They ended up being incorporated into the armies of the people who ruled over them now, and they would be like, okay, we're drafting you for this war over here, or we're stationing you over here. So we know this stuff happens. The Persians are going to take, or the Greeks are going to take Jews, they're going to put them up here in Turkey. The Persians are going to take Jews and put them down here in Egypt, and that's where the Elephantine Island cult goes. That matches very well with the tritheist cult of Susa, okay? Susa is where Daniel, Esther, and Nehemiah all were, so it makes sense. They're synthesizing ideas. We also know these same people were up in Armenia, up in Bactria, and down in India. We also know there was Jewish colonies as far to the southern tip of India. So I'm not saying that the Jews are the source of all this syncretism and the transmission of ideas, but it's possible because we know they're syncretists. We know they're in the heart of the Persian Empire and on the outskirts of the Persian Empire, and we know at least from Egypt they do have merchants among them, and we know that they have common peoples among them who have their own language along with the languages that they're mixing, and then we know that they have a cult down here in Elephantine Island, which is very similar to a cult that they have in Persia. So the idea of reincarnation comes from the Greek, and it has to do with the transmigration of souls from people to idols. It spreads to Pythagoras here. We know he gets it from the Egyptians. It's very likely then, if Jews are here and here, that it's spreading to Lao Tzu is going to pick it up here in Sogdia, and Siddhartha Gautama is going to pick it up here in Nepal. And then the Upanishads, the Indians are going to start to pick it up after that. And that's where reincarnation starts to get cycled into their systematic. Trying to think what else. Oh, the other thing that you need to know about these guys, and this is a common thing, I can't say who did what. It was very common as these schools of thought developed. It's kind of like how the apostles are writing letters based on things Christ said, but they're giving some interpretation. You have the same things going on with Buddha, with Lao Tzu, with Pythagoras. You have people... That's why they have like Neoplatonists and Neo-Pythagoras. You have later developments of their views, but the views are still going to be called after them. So nothing was written down about Siddhartha Gautama or Buddha till probably like a couple hundred years after he lived. Nothing was written down religiously, but we have evidence from I think it was either Ashoka or Maryagupta. I think one of them is Jain and one of them is Buddhist, and I think it was Ashoka that was Buddhist. We know from the fact that he tried to push Buddhism as the state religion that it existed by that time. We just don't have writings of here's what Buddha said and here's why. We have same thing with Muhammad. We're going to have the same thing a couple hundred years after Muhammad. We're going to have some skittish sources about who Muhammad is, what he did. There's this guy who comes up and says the name Muhammad wouldn't have existed because the Arabic alphabet and script that existed at that time wouldn't have allowed for the pronunciation of his name. And he figures out Muhammad is based on this term Mahmud, which is basically a term borrowed from a Hebrew, which means like something like the beautiful one or something like that. And it's a term for the Messiah. Okay. So here's the other thing. Mahmud, Mahdi, Maitreya, which is built off of Mithra. And then there's this coming prophet philosopher of Zoroastrianism. What all of these are ripoffs of the coming Messiah that comes from the Jews. And so as these syncretic faiths are spreading around, they're all adopting the idea of this coming world teacher who's actually Jesus Christ. This is why. And this is why the Magi come looking for him. Okay? This coming world teacher who's meant to be the king of the world. Remember, they have their legendary figures like Zarathustra, like Shem or Melchizedek. Okay? And the idea of one that's going to come after that and set the world right and reunify the world and bring world peace and teach us all the things of the gods appropriately because we're all confused because of Babel. That idea spread around to these other religions. And if those people in that faith didn't have a bias or didn't have a bone to pick, they would have been like, oh, that's Jesus, and accepted Christ. Okay? But because a lot of these faiths had a pre-existing religious class that didn't want this coming new faith, and this idea is so prominent, it's among the Native Americans. They literally have this it's called the Seven Fires Prophecy, where it's like, we don't know where this came from. It's very old. It's oral. Maybe in the 20th century, it started being expressed. And it was this idea of this coming new way. They called it this coming new way of these people who are going to come with this new way. And if they came, this is a very old prophecy that was before the white men came here, supposedly. If they came with this new way with an open hand, in other words, unarmed, they're to be received. But if they came with a sword, they would be rejected. And basically, the idea is literally we don't know where this came from. We just know the Native Americans say it today, and they say it's very old. And there's stuff about the coming of the white man, coming of Christianity, and people bringing it either violently, aka your Calvinists and your Dominionist Catholics, or peacefully, aka your evangelicals. And the idea was you're supposed to receive it from the peaceful, but not from the warriors. Okay? And then they would say how this, I'm going to butcher this, but essentially that the elders of their old way, because remember, their old way was this memorization of traditions, and these traditions, God is going to work within these traditions. And what he's going to do is, most of these people have their traditions, and it's a way of remembering what was passed down to their fathers about God or about the gods, okay? Christ is going to enter into that and say, those of you who are trying to honor what came before you because you're trying to just do the right thing and honor God and yada, 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 they're going to be receptive to the gospel. And so he's planting these seeds of this coming world teacher and this, new way that's going to be replaced, just like he has among the Jews. There's going to be a prophet to come, and him you need to hear, okay? There's going to be a new way that's for everybody, okay? But this is in the Seven Fires prophecy too. They're going to say the people who were the elders who kept the old way are going to find themselves becoming irrelevant, and so they're not going to want to change because it's going to make them irrelevant. And this is what you have in the world. This is why the Brahmins kill the Apostle Thomas. They're the guardians of the old way, and they don't want to become irrelevant. What are you going to do? This is how you guys made your living for thousands of years. They don't want to become irrelevant. And this is what happens wherever Christianity goes, is the people who just want to preserve the old way, including the Jews, they kill the people who tell you about the new way. Well, the new way was based on the original old God, which is why the last book of the Bible calls him the S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness, because in all of these religions, in Egypt, in Sumer, in India, all of them, the original God was the sun god. The original God that met with men. And they understood he was the son of a higher father god. But like, you have this idea replete throughout all these religions. There's a sun god that was a father of a heavenly god that was more transcendent. And then there was a spirit god that had to do with the breath of life and the wind and the air, which is the Holy Spirit. So they had a version of this, but the third was the Son of Righteousness, and then the Spirit is feminine. So the last book of the Old Testament, which is written among the Persians, where all this is being disseminated, describes comparing a man's wife to his spirit, describes the Lord as the Son of Righteousness, and describes the Father as all of our Father. Do not we all have one Father? Did not one God create us? This is in Malachi. And Malachi literally means my angel or my messenger. You can't get around this. And then it describes the coming of the teacher. The coming of the teacher and the herald that's going to herald the coming of the teacher. Okay? He's the Son of Righteousness. And he's going to bring judgment and justice and return the hearts of the children to their fathers, a.k.a. you reunite the Jews and the Gentiles. Okay? So what am I saying? Am I saying that all religions are one, they're all true, they're all syncretic, and this is good? No. What I'm saying is the original influences of all the world's religions was Genesis 1 through 9. And then there were other stuff that came from Canaanites, came from Sethites. The Nephilim are just a corruption of the seed of the woman promise. The Canaanite ideas of faith are based on Cain's lie of God just picking Abel over him because he was the farmer, and God likes shepherds better than farmers, and that wasn't his fault. So it's all fate, and fate's not in his favor. The odds are not in his favor, so he's a Hunger Games contestant. And then the Canaanite ideas that happen after the flood that are corruption of these ideas, all the bad ideas come from either corruptions of true ideas or false ideas that are presumed, or combinations of the two. But the original thread of this original God, who's the Son of Righteousness or the Son of Justice, who sees all and judges justly, but is also merciful. This is the thread that's pulling through the whole thing. So, again, as I continue with this book, Serpent by the Way, these maps, these details are going to be a part of it. You're going to see these ideas kind of fleshed out in a theme. But the focus of that theme is going to be two main religions. The one is the truth, which is this one thread of, the Judeo-Christian scriptures. The other one is going to be this false one, which is basically based around fate, reincarnation, and the idea of us causing ourselves to ascend to being gods, which we're going to find pulled from this combination of Sumer in Egypt, all the way through the Greeks and the Hindus, all the way through to the image of the beast. And you have your Christ and your Antichrist. So I hope you guys are blessed by this. I hope that makes sense to you guys who are paying attention. And then I am going to keep working on this. And as I feel the need to do another brain dump, I'll post another video. So you guys have a great rest of the week. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.